Look at her cheap clothes. The flight attendant sneered, pointing a manicured finger at the woman in the oversized, stained hoodie. She thinks she belongs in first class. Security must be sleeping. The crew laughed. Passengers filmed. They saw a charity case. They saw a woman who didn't belong. But what they didn't see was the black card in her pocket or the name on the side of the fuselage. They were busy mocking her appearance, completely unaware that the woman they were about to humiliate actually owned the plane. And when the head of security finally walks through that cabin door, let's just say the pilot isn't the only one who's going to crash and burn today. Before we dive into this shocking story, tell me something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe respect isn't about designer labels or expensive jewelry, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Because in exactly 14 minutes, this woman they're all laughing at will reveal she doesn't just fly first class. She owns the entire airline. You are not ready for this ending. The sliding glass doors of JFK International Airport Terminal 4 hissed open, admitting a gust of biting November wind and a woman who looked like she carried the weight of the entire world on her slumped shoulders. The automatic doors seemed to hesitate before her, as if even the building's sensors couldn't quite believe she belonged in this gleaming cathedral of luxury travel. Alicia Davidson didn't look like a power player. She didn't look like the kind of woman who could buy and sell the building she was walking through. She didn't look like someone who had just inherited one of America's largest airlines. On this particular Tuesday evening, Alicia looked like a shadow of herself, a ghost haunting the corridors of corporate wealth and privilege. She was wearing a pair of gray heather sweatpants she'd bought at Target 3 years ago, stained slightly at the knee with coffee that had spilled during her father's final hours in the hospital. Her hoodie was black, 2 sizes too big and fraying at the cuffs, where she'd nervously picked at the threads during 48 hours of vigil. Her hair, usually braided in intricate professional styles befitting her secret status as heir to a transportation empire, was pulled back into a messy, frizzy bun that screamed exhaustion and grief. She dragged a scuffed carry-on bag behind her, one wheel squeaking with each rotation. Her eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, even though it was overcast outside and the terminal lights were dim. To the casual observer rushing past with their Louis Vuitton luggage and Hermes scarves, Alicia looked like someone who had slept on a bench outside the terminal. To the elite travelers rushing toward the priority check-in lanes, she was an obstacle to navigate around. "Excuse me, move it." A man in a bespoke Italian suit grunted, shouldering past her without breaking stride. His leather briefcase clipped her hip hard enough to make her stumble. Alicia didn't fight back. She didn't even look up. She just steadied herself against a marble pillar and took a deep, shaky breath. "Just get home," she whispered to herself. "Just get to London. Sign the papers. Bury him." The grief was a physical weight in her chest, pressing down like a steel plate every time she tried to breathe normally. Her father, Theodore Davidson, the founder of Monarch Airlines, had passed away 48 hours ago. It had been sudden. A massive heart attack while reviewing quarterly reports in his corner office overlooking the Thames. Alicia had been at his bedside in the ICU at Mount Sinai for 2 days straight, wearing these same clothes, drinking vending machine coffee, holding the hand of the only parent she had left until it went cold. She hadn't showered. She hadn't slept more than 20 minutes at a time. She certainly hadn't dressed for the part of billionaire heiress. She just wanted to get on the flagship flight of her father's company, the company she now secretly owned 65% of, and fly to the headquarters in London to finalize the funeral arrangements that awaited her signature. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to board a Monarch Airlines flight while looking like someone who couldn't afford a bus ticket. Alicia approached the Monarch Elite first-class check-in counter, her worn sneakers silent on the plush red carpet that had been imported from Belgium specifically for this premium service area. The carpet alone cost more than most people made in a year. She had signed the purchase order herself back when she was still pretending to be just another doctor working quietly in Seattle, staying out of the family business and the limelight that came with it. There were 2 agents behind the pristine white marble desk, both impeccably dressed in the navy blue Monarch uniforms that she had helped redesign 5 years ago during a brief consulting stint with the company's brand management team. One agent was typing furiously on a tablet, responding to what appeared to be urgent messages. The other, a young Latina woman with a tight ponytail that pulled her features into a perpetually surprised expression, was applying lip gloss with the concentration of a surgeon. The nameplate on the counter read Sofia Martinez, Senior Customer Relations Specialist. Sofia had worked for Monarch for 3 years, starting in economy check-in, and working her way up to this coveted position, serving the airline's most valuable customers. She took pride in maintaining the exclusive atmosphere that first-class passengers expected. She had learned to spot the difference between old money and new money, between legitimate wealth and pretenders, between those who belonged in this rarefied air and those who were trying to fake their way in. Alicia stepped up to the counter, her movement barely registering in Sofia's peripheral vision. The agent finished applying her gloss, pressed her lips together with a soft smack, and then looked over Alicia's shoulder, scanning the area behind her for what she assumed was the real passenger approaching the counter. When Sofia's eyes finally lowered to meet Alicia's face, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows furrowed in confusion. Her expression shifted from professional politeness to barely concealed disdain as she took in the stained sweatpants, the oversized hoodie, the general air of someone who definitely did not belong in the first-class check-in area. "Ma'am Sophia," said her voice dripping with the kind of sweetly condescending tone typically reserved for lost children or confused elderly passengers. "The economy drop-off counter is located at the other end of the terminal near the food court. Row H. This area is exclusively for our elite members and first-class passengers." Alicia's voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper. The grief had taken most of her strength, leaving her words raspy from 2 days of crying and hardly any sleep. "I know where I am. I'm checking in for Flight 802 to London Heathrow." Sophia's confusion deepened. She glanced at her colleague, Brad Wilson, a 31-year-old man with perfectly pressed shirt cuffs and a tie that cost more than Alicia's entire outfit. Brad looked up from his tablet with the expression of someone who had just witnessed something mildly amusing but ultimately insignificant. "Flight 802. Sophia repeated as if the words didn't quite make sense coming from someone dressed like Alicia. "That's our flagship international route. The cheapest seat on that flight is $800, and that's if you book 6 months in advance." Alicia reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out her passport, sliding it across the marble counter with trembling fingers. Her hands were shaking not from nervousness but from exhaustion and the emotional toll of the past 2 days. "My name is Alicia Davidson, Seat 1A. Sophia's laugh was sharp and quick like the bark of a small dog. She looked at Brad, then back at Alicia, her expression a mixture of disbelief and amusement. "Seat 1A. Honey, Seat 1A is our premier sky suite. It's $12,000 one way. That's more than most people make in a month." She picked up the passport as if it were contaminated with something unpleasant, holding it between 2 manicured fingers while she examined the cover. "Did you find this somewhere? Because if this is stolen, identification security takes that very seriously here." Alicia's patience, already stretched thin by grief and exhaustion, began to fray at the edges. But she had learned long ago that raising her voice or showing anger would only confirm whatever assumptions people had already made about her. "I purchased my ticket. Please check your computer." Sophia rolled her eyes in an exaggerated display of annoyance and typed Alicia's name into the reservation computer. She was expecting an error message or perhaps a notification that no such passenger existed. What she got instead made her frown and hit the refresh button. The screen displayed Davidson Alicia M. Seat 1A. Status VIP. Do not upset. Special handling required. Contact corporate liaison for any issues. Sophia stared at the screen for a long moment, then hit refresh again. The same information appeared. She looked at Alicia's hoodie, then back at the screen, then at the passport in her hand. The pieces didn't fit together in her mind. "System glitch," she muttered to Brad loud enough for Alicia to hear. "Has to be. Probably an employee standby ticket that got coded wrong in the computer. I've seen this before." She printed the boarding pass with obvious reluctance, but instead of handing it to Alicia with the warm smile that first-class passengers typically received, she slid it across the counter with 2 fingers, as if even brief contact might somehow transfer whatever misfortune had led to Alicia's current appearance. "Gate B12, Sophia said curtly. "Boarding begins in 20 minutes. And just so you know," she added, leaning forward conspiratorially, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "security does random verification checks at the gate. If you've somehow obtained this ticket fraudulently, or if this credit card was stolen, they will catch you before you get anywhere near that aircraft." Alicia took the boarding pass and passport, her movements deliberate and controlled despite the storm of emotions raging inside her chest. She wanted to scream. She wanted to explain that she didn't just own a seat on this plane, she owned the plane itself. She owned the terminal they were standing in. She owned the company that paid Sophia's salary. But she didn't have the energy. She just wanted to disappear into the privacy of the first-class suite and grieve for her father without an audience. "Thank you," Alicia whispered, turning away from the counter. As she walked away, pulling her squeaking suitcase behind her, she heard Sophia's voice behind her speaking to Brad in a tone that wasn't quite quiet enough to be private. "Trash. I don't know how people like that even get through security." The walk from the check-in counter to gate B12 felt like running a gauntlet. Alicia kept her head down and her sunglasses on, but she could feel the stares following her through the high-end terminal shopping area. Designer boutiques lined both sides of the corridor, their windows displaying handbags that cost more than most cars and jewelry that sparkled under carefully calibrated lighting. The other passengers moving through this section of Terminal 4 were dressed in a uniform of wealth cashmere coats, Italian leather shoes, watches that could fund a small business. They dragged Hermès luggage and spoke in the confident tones of people who had never been questioned about whether they belonged somewhere. Alicia was a gray smudge in a world of gold and platinum. Every step reminded her of how out of place she looked, how far she had fallen from the polished professional image she had maintained for years, while secretly preparing to inherit her father's empire. A group of women in designer yoga wear whispered as she passed their conversation, stopping mid-sentence as they took in her appearance. A businessman in a 3-piece suit made a point of stepping aside when she approached as if poverty might be contagious. A mother with 2 perfectly dressed children pulled them closer to her side, using the gesture that people employed when they encountered someone they deemed potentially dangerous. By the time Alicia reached gate B12, her emotional reserves were running on empty. The grief was exhausting enough without having to endure the constant judgment of strangers who had decided her worth based on her appearance. The gate area was exactly what she had expected, a shrine to luxury travel. Leather seating arranged in intimate clusters, complimentary refreshment stations offering premium coffee and imported pastries, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac where the Monarch Airlines aircraft waited, its distinctive deep blue livery gleaming under the terminal lights. Boarding had already commenced when she arrived. The first-class lane was nearly empty save for the gate agent and a member of the cabin crew who had come up from the aircraft to coordinate the boarding process. The gate agent was a young man named Kyle Roberts, 26 years old, with the kind of eager-to-please demeanor that suggested he was still relatively new to this position. His uniform was immaculate. His smile practiced his movements efficient as he scanned boarding passes and directed passengers down the jet bridge. The flight attendant standing beside him was a different story entirely. Tiffany Parker was 34 years old and the picture of corporate perfection. The Monarch Airlines uniform, a navy blue pencil skirt, crisp white blouse, and silk red scarf tied precisely at the neck, fit her flawlessly as if it had been designed specifically for her body. Her blonde hair was styled in a chignon so tight it seemed to pull her eyes back, giving her face a perpetually alert, predatory expression. Tiffany was currently laughing at something Kyle had said, her voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned her place in the hierarchy of air travel. She had been with Monarch for 8 years, working her way up from domestic economy flights to this prestigious international first-class route. She took pride in maintaining what she called cabin standards, which meant ensuring that first-class passengers received the exclusive experience they had paid for. As Alicia approached the boarding lane, Tiffany's conversation with Kyle stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes locked onto Alicia like a security computer that had detected an intruder. Without hesitation, she stepped directly into Alicia's path, her hand raised in the universal gesture of authority. "Excuse me," Tiffany said, her voice carrying the kind of false politeness that barely concealed contempt. "Economy boarding hasn't been called yet. You'll need to wait in the general seating area until Group 5 is announced." Alicia stopped fatigue, making her movement slow and deliberate. She looked at Tiffany's name tag. Tiffany Parker, Senior Purser. The title meant she was in charge of the entire cabin crew for this flight. "I'm not in Group 5, Alicia said, holding out her boarding pass. The paper trembled slightly in her grip, betraying the exhaustion she was trying to hide. "I'm in first class." Tiffany didn't take the boarding pass. Instead, she looked Alicia up and down with the critical eye of someone appraising livestock at auction. Her gaze lingered on the coffee stain on the sweatpants, the frayed cuffs of the hoodie, the scuffed sneakers that had seen better days. A smirk played at the corners of Tiffany's perfectly painted red lips. When she spoke, her voice was deliberately loud enough to carry to the business class passengers who were beginning to line up behind them. "Let me guess," Tiffany said, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "You received an upgrade notification, or perhaps you're traveling as someone's domestic employee." The words hit Alicia like physical blows. She had endured whispered comments and sideways glances throughout her journey to the gate. But this was the first time someone had openly challenged her right to be there. "I am a passenger," Alicia stated, her voice gaining strength despite her exhaustion. "Please move aside so I can board. Don't take that tone with me." Tiffany snapped her customer service mask, slipping. "I am responsible for the safety and atmosphere of the first-class cabin. Our guests pay thousands of dollars for exclusivity and a premium experience. They don't pay to sit next to whatever this is." She gestured vaguely at Alicia's entire existence, as if the words to describe what she saw were too distasteful to speak aloud. Tiffany barked at the gate agent. "Check her pass thoroughly. Check for fraud." Kyle, looking nervous, took the pass from Alicia. He scanned it. The machine beeped green. It says she's valid, Tiffany." Kyle stammered. "Seat 1A." Tiffany snatched the pass from Kyle's hand. She stared at it. "Alicia Davidson," she read. The name meant nothing to her. Monarch Air was a massive conglomerate. The employees knew the CEO, Theodore Davidson, but few knew his estranged daughter, who had spent the last 10 years working as a quiet doctor in Seattle, staying out of the limelight. "Davidson," Tiffany scoffed. "Probably a common name. Look, I don't know how you hacked the computer or who you convinced to give you this ticket, but I'm watching you." She thrust the ticket back at Alicia, the paper tearing slightly at one corner. As the confrontation at the boarding gate escalated, other passengers began to take notice. What had started as a routine boarding process was turning into something that demanded attention, and in the age of smartphones and social media, attention meant documentation. Emma Rodriguez, a 24-year-old travel blogger from Miami, had been documenting her journey for her growing YouTube channel when she noticed the commotion at the first-class boarding lane. Emma specialized in luxury travel content, showcasing premium airline experiences and high-end destinations for her audience of aspirational travelers. She had been filming B-roll footage of the gate area when Tiffany's voice became loud enough to cut through the ambient terminal noise. Emma's influencer instincts kicked in immediately. This was the kind of authentic, unscripted content that her audience craved. Real drama, real conflict, real human emotion playing out in real time. She raised her phone and began recording her finger hovering over the Go Live button on Instagram. "Something's happening at the Monarch Gate," she whispered into her phone's camera. "A flight attendant is having some kind of confrontation with a passenger. This is not normal, guys." Several feet away, James Thompson, a 28-year-old business consultant from Denver, was also watching the scene unfold. James had been waiting for his business class boarding group to be called when he noticed what appeared to be discrimination happening in real time. Unlike Emma, whose first instinct was to create content, James's reaction was more visceral. He had grown up in a household where civil rights were discussed at the dinner table, where his parents had taught him that silence in the face of injustice made him complicit. James opened the live stream feature on his Twitter account and aimed his phone at the boarding area. Within seconds, viewers began joining his stream. His follower count wasn't huge, around 8,000 people, mostly professional contacts and friends, but his audience was engaged and active. "I'm watching what appears to be racial profiling happening at JFK. Right now," he said into his phone, his voice tight with anger. "A Monarch Airlines employee is preventing a black woman from boarding a flight she clearly has a ticket for." David Kim, a 35-year-old technology executive from San Francisco, wasn't filming anything, but he was listening, and what he heard made his stomach turn. David had experienced his own share of discrimination in corporate America, the subtle ways that people questioned his credentials or his presence in executive meetings. He recognized the tone in Tiffany's voice, the way she wielded authority like a weapon against someone she deemed unworthy of respect. As the confrontation continued, other passengers began choosing sides. Some moved closer, drawn by curiosity and the spectacle of conflict. Others deliberately moved away, uncomfortable with the public nature of what was happening but unwilling to get involved. An elderly woman with a Louis Vuitton bag muttered to her companion, "I don't understand why they let just anyone into the premium areas these days. Standards have really fallen." A middle-aged businessman nodded in agreement, adjusting his expensive watch. "That's exactly why I pay for first class, to avoid situations like this." But not everyone was siding with Tiffany. A young mother traveling with her teenage daughter watched with obvious discomfort. "Mom," the teenager whispered, "this isn't right. She has a ticket." "Shh," her mother replied, but her expression suggested she agreed with her daughter's assessment. Kyle Roberts, the gate agent caught in the middle of this situation, was becoming increasingly nervous. He had been trained to handle difficult passengers, but this situation was unlike anything covered in his orientation materials. The passenger in question wasn't being difficult. She was calm, polite, and had provided valid documentation. The problem seemed to be coming from his colleague, not the customer. Tiffany Kyle said quietly, hoping to de-escalate the situation her boarding pass scanned fine. "Maybe we should just—" Tiffany cut him off sharply. "I've been doing this job for 8 years. I know how to spot someone who doesn't belong. Trust me on this." Emma Rodriguez had made her decision. She tapped the Go Live button and immediately began narrating what she was seeing to her audience. "Guys, I am literally watching discrimination happen in real time at JFK Airport," she said into her phone, making sure her voice was loud enough to be heard, but not so loud as to interfere with the ongoing confrontation. A Monarch Airlines flight attendant is refusing to let a black passenger board with what appears to be a valid first-class ticket. Comments began flooding Emma's live stream within seconds. "This is 2024. How is this still happening? Record everything. What airline is this? They need to be exposed. Is security there? Someone call security." James Thompson's live stream was gaining viewers even faster. His corporate network was sharing the stream, and his follower count was climbing in real time as people tuned in to witness what was happening. "The passenger has shown her boarding pass multiple times," James narrated to his audience. "It's been scanned and verified as valid, but the flight attendant continues to block her from boarding based on, well, you can see for yourself what this is based on." David Kim finally decided he couldn't remain silent. He approached the boarding area, his expression grim but determined. "Excuse me," he said to Tiffany, his voice calm but firm. "I couldn't help but notice this situation." "Is there a problem with this passenger's documentation?" Tiffany turned to David with barely concealed irritation. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. Please return to the waiting area." "Actually, it does concern me," David replied. "I'm a passenger on this flight, and I'm watching what appears to be discriminatory treatment of another passenger. If there's a legitimate security concern, perhaps you could explain what it is?" Tiffany's face flushed slightly. She wasn't used to having her authority questioned, especially not in front of other passengers, and especially not when those passengers were filming the interaction. "Security concerns are not discussed publicly," she said, falling back on corporate policy. "If you continue to interfere with airline operations, I'll have to ask security to escort you from the gate as well." The threat backfired. Instead of intimidating David into silence, it only confirmed his suspicions about what was really happening. And it provided perfect content for the growing number of people who were now watching this interaction unfold on social media. Emma's livestream viewer count had climbed to over 3,000 people. James's Twitter stream was being shared and reshared across platforms, and in the background, other passengers continued to document the scene with their own phones, creating multiple angles and perspectives of what was quickly becoming a public relations disaster for Monarch Airlines. But Alicia Davidson, standing at the center of this growing storm, remained quiet. She clutched her boarding pass and waited, drawing on reserves of patience that were nearly depleted, but not quite gone. She had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice was simply refusing to disappear. The situation might have continued to escalate indefinitely, if not for the arrival of another Monarch Airlines employee from the aircraft itself. Miguel Santos, a 26-year-old junior flight attendant, emerged from the jet bridge, looking harried and slightly out of breath. Miguel had been sent by the cabin crew to check on the boarding delay. Passengers who had already boarded were asking questions about when departure might commence, and the pilots were getting impatient about the schedule. Tiffany Miguel called as he approached the gate area. "We're running behind schedule. The captain wants to know what's causing the delay in first-class boarding." Tiffany turned to Miguel with obvious relief. Here was someone who would understand the situation, someone who would support her decision to maintain cabin standards. "We have a passenger with questionable documentation," she said, gesturing toward Alicia. "I'm conducting a thorough verification before allowing boarding." Miguel looked at Alicia, taking in her appearance with the same critical eye that Tiffany had employed. His expression immediately shifted to one of understanding and agreement. "I see," Miguel said, nodding sagely. "Well, we certainly can't compromise the first-class experience for our legitimate passengers." The use of the word legitimate sent a ripple of reaction through the growing crowd of onlookers. Emma's livestream comments exploded with outrage. James's Twitter followers were already screenshotting the conversation and sharing it across multiple platforms. David Kim stepped forward again. "Excuse me, but I heard her boarding pass scanned successfully." "On what basis are you determining that she's not a legitimate passenger?" Miguel, emboldened by having an ally in Tiffany, decided to be more direct than his senior colleague had been. "Sir, I think it's obvious to everyone here that this passenger doesn't fit the profile of our typical first-class clientele," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed he was stating an undeniable truth. The words hung in the air like a confession. Miguel had said out loud what Tiffany had been implying through her actions. He had made explicit the assumptions that had been driving this entire confrontation. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Emma's livestream viewers began flooding the chat with demands for the airline's contact information. James's followers started organizing to share the video across every social media platform available. Even passengers who hadn't been paying attention before were now fully engaged, pulling out their own phones to capture what had become an undeniable example of discrimination caught on camera. Alicia, still standing quietly in the boarding lane, felt something shift inside her chest. The grief was still there, still weighing her down like a physical burden. But alongside it, a familiar flame was beginning to kindle. It was the same fire that had driven her father to build an airline empire from nothing. The same determination that had pushed her through medical school and residency despite the obstacles placed in her path. For the first time since arriving at the airport, Alicia Davidson began to remember exactly who she was. The gathering crowd had created an amphitheater of judgment around the boarding gate. What had started as a simple passenger verification had morphed into something much larger and more dangerous. A public spectacle that was being broadcast live to thousands of viewers across multiple social media platforms. Tiffany Parker, sensing that the situation was spiraling beyond her control, decided to double down on her authority. In her mind, backing down now would be seen as weakness, both by the passengers watching and by her junior colleague Miguel, who was looking to her for leadership. "Ma'am Tiffany," said to Alicia, her voice taking on the tone of someone addressing a child who had been caught misbehaving. "I'm going to need you to step aside so that legitimate first-class passengers can board. We're already behind schedule because of this irregularity." The word irregularity was chosen carefully. It suggested that Alicia's presence was an anomaly, a glitch in the computer rather than a paying customer with rights and dignity. Emma Rodriguez, still live streaming to her growing audience, provided real-time commentary on what her viewers were witnessing. "The flight attendant is now referring to this passenger as an irregularity," she whispered into her phone. "This is absolutely unbelievable. The racism is it's right there in the open." Her comment section was moving so fast it was difficult to read individual messages, but the sentiment was clear. Viewers were outraged, sharing the stream, tagging news outlets and civil rights organizations. The hashtag #MonarchShame had begun to emerge organically, with users across multiple platforms picking it up and amplifying the story. James Thompson's live stream had attracted the attention of several prominent civil rights activists who had begun sharing his feed with their own substantial followings. The viewer count on his stream had climbed past 5,000 and showed no signs of slowing down. "What we're seeing here," James said to his audience, trying to maintain journalistic objectivity, while his anger simmered beneath the surface, is a textbook example of how implicit bias becomes explicit discrimination. This passenger has done nothing wrong, violated no policies, and presented valid documentation. The only irregularity here appears to be the color of her skin. David Kim had positioned himself strategically between Tiffany and Alicia, not quite inserting himself into the confrontation, but making it clear that he was witnessing and documenting everything that happened. "I'm sorry," David said to Tiffany, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to corporate boardrooms, "but I need to understand what specific policy this passenger has violated, because from where I'm standing it looks like she's being denied boarding based solely on her appearance." Tiffany's face was beginning to flush red, a combination of embarrassment and anger at having her authority questioned so publicly. She was used to passengers accepting her judgment without question, especially when it came to maintaining what she considered appropriate standards for the premium cabin. "Sir, I've already explained that passenger verification procedures are confidential," she said, her voice rising slightly. "If you continue to interfere with airline operations, I will be forced to call security." But the threat no longer carried the weight it had earlier. Too many people were watching, too many phones were recording, and too many witnesses were ready to testify about what they had observed. Miguel Santos, perhaps sensing that his earlier comment had been too explicit, tried a different approach. "Look," he said, addressing the growing crowd rather than Alicia directly. "We all know what first-class passengers typically look like. We have standards to maintain for the comfort and safety of all our guests." If Miguel thought this explanation would diffuse the situation, he was catastrophically wrong. By attempting to normalize discrimination as standards, he had provided even more damning evidence of the bias driving their actions. Kyle Roberts, the gate agent, who had been caught in the middle of this escalating confrontation, finally found his voice. "Tiffany," he said quietly, "maybe we should contact a supervisor. This situation is getting out of hand." "No," Tiffany snapped. "I am the supervisor for this flight. I make the decisions about passenger suitability, and I've made my decision." Alicia, who had remained silent through most of this exchange, finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it carried clearly through the gate area. "What decision is that?" she asked. The question was simple, direct, and devastating. Because Tiffany couldn't answer it honestly without admitting to discrimination, and she couldn't provide a legitimate reason because none existed. "The decision," Tiffany said, scrambling for an explanation that would sound official to verify your identity and payment method before allowing you to access a $12,000 seat. "My identity has been verified," Alicia replied calmly. "My boarding pass has been scanned and confirmed as valid. What additional verification do you require?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Tiffany looked around the gate area, suddenly aware of just how many people were watching this interaction. Phone cameras were pointed at her from multiple angles. The live stream comments were becoming increasingly hostile toward her and the airline. But instead of de-escalating, Tiffany made the decision that would ultimately cost her everything. "Fine," she said, her voice loud enough to carry throughout the gate area. "If you want to play this game, we'll play it properly. Miguel, call airport security. Tell them we have a passenger with suspicious documentation attempting to board with what may be a fraudulent ticket." The words were barely out of her mouth before the crowd erupted in disbelief. Even passengers who hadn't been paying close attention were now fully engaged, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Emma's live stream exploded with viewers. Her follower count was climbing in real time as people shared the stream across platforms. "Did you hear that?" she said into her camera, her voice shaking with indignation. "She just called security on a passenger with a valid ticket. This is insane." James Thompson's stream had attracted the attention of major news outlets. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News producers were already in the comments section asking for permission to use his footage. But perhaps most importantly, David Kim made a decision that would ensure this incident didn't disappear into corporate damage control. He pulled up the phone number for Monarch Airlines corporate headquarters and placed a call to their media relations department. "Yes," he said. "When the call was answered, I'm calling to report a discrimination incident involving your employees at JFK Airport. You're going to want to get someone down here immediately because this is being live streamed to thousands of people and it's about to become a major problem for your company." Meanwhile, Alicia Davidson stood quietly in the center of the storm she had not asked for but would not run from. In her pocket, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. She looked at the screen and saw the name that made her heart skip: Samantha Torres, her executive assistant and the one person outside the legal team who knew about her inheritance. Alicia looked around at the cameras, the crowd, the airline employees who had just called security to have her arrested. She thought about her father, about the values he had tried to instill in his company, about the legacy he would have wanted her to protect. She answered the call. As Miguel Santos hurried down the jet bridge to call airport security, the situation at Gate B12 had transformed into something resembling a small-scale media event. Passengers who were supposed to be boarding the aircraft were instead gathering around to witness what many of them recognized as a potential civil rights incident unfolding in real time. Ashley Ford, a 31-year-old economy cabin flight attendant, had come up from the aircraft to check on the boarding delay when she encountered Miguel rushing past her toward the gate's administrative office. "Miguel, what's going on?" Ashley asked, grabbing his arm as he passed. "The pilots are asking about the delay and passengers are getting restless." Miguel paused, slightly out of breath from his hurried movement. "Tiffany's dealing with a passenger situation. Someone with fake documentation trying to scam their way into first class. She's called security. Ashley's eyes widened with interest rather than concern. In her 3 years with Monarch Airlines, she had heard stories about passengers attempting to hack, upgrade computers, or forge boarding passes. These incidents had become something of airline industry legend shared among crew members as cautionary tales about maintaining vigilance. Really, Ashley said, her voice taking on the tone of someone who had just learned about particularly juicy gossip. What do they look like? Exactly what you'd expect, Miguel replied with a knowing look. Homeless chic trying to pass for luxury traveler. Tiffany spotted it immediately. The 2 crew members moved back toward the gate area together, and Ashley got her first look at Alicia Davidson. Her reaction was immediate and unfiltered. "Oh my God," Ashley said loud enough for several passengers to hear you weren't kidding. "Look at those clothes. That hoodie probably came from Goodwill." Her comment sparked a ripple of reaction through the crowd. Emma Rodriguez, still live streaming, immediately turned her camera toward Ashley. "Now we have a second Monarch employee making derogatory comments about this passenger's appearance," Emma narrated to her audience. "This is clearly not just one person's bias. This is company culture." James Thompson's livestream chat was moving so fast with outraged comments that it was impossible to read individual messages. Hashtags were multiplying across platforms. Monarch shame airline discrimination, JFK, racism, and boycott Monarch were all beginning to trend. But the crew members, insulated in their bubble of assumed authority and mutual reinforcement, seemed oblivious to the damage they were inflicting on their own company's reputation. Ashley approached Tiffany with the confidence of someone joining what she assumed was a righteous cause. "Tiffany, Miguel told me about the situation. Do you need backup with this person?" The way Ashley said person, with a slight pause that suggested she had considered using a different word, sent another wave of anger through the observing crowd. Tiffany, feeling emboldened by having additional crew support, decided to make her position even clearer. "Ashley, thank you. Yes, we need to maintain standards. Our first-class passengers pay premium prices for a premium experience, and that includes the assurance that everyone in that cabin belongs there." David Kim, who had been quietly observing while simultaneously communicating with his corporate contacts and social media followers, finally reached his breaking point. "Belongs there," David repeated, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the gate area. "Based on what criteria? What exactly determines who belongs in first class, besides having a valid ticket and paying the fare?" His question was directed at Tiffany, but it carried throughout the gate area, reaching the ears of dozens of passengers who were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something historic, a real-time documentation of institutional racism in action. Tiffany, Ashley, and Miguel exchanged glances. They had been operating under assumptions that felt natural and justified to them, but David's direct question forced them to articulate criteria they had never had to defend publicly. "It's about maintaining appropriate atmosphere," Ashley said, stepping forward to support her colleague. "Our first-class cabin attracts business executives, diplomats, celebrities, people with a certain level of sophistication." Sophistication. David repeated the word as if it tasted bitter. "And you determine sophistication. How? By looking at someone's clothing. By making assumptions about their income based on their appearance." Emma's livestream audience had grown to over 8,000 viewers. Her comment section was a constant stream of outrage support for the passenger being discriminated against and demands for accountability from Monarch Airlines. "This is absolutely surreal," Emma narrated to her camera. 3 airline employees are now openly admitting that they profile passengers based on appearance and deny service based on their subjective assessment of who belongs in premium seating. Meanwhile, Alicia Davidson remained on her phone call with Samantha Torres. Her voice was quiet, but those close enough to hear could make out fragments of her conversation. "Yes, Sam, it's happening now. No, I'm not hurt, just humiliated. 3 crew members and counting. Yes, there are witnesses. Multiple live streams. Kyle Roberts. The gate agent, who had been trying unsuccessfully to de-escalate the situation, made one final attempt to restore some semblance of normal procedure. "Look," he said, addressing his colleagues more than the crowd her boarding pass scanned correctly. "The computer shows her as a valid passenger. Maybe we should just let her board and sort out any issues with corporate later." But Tiffany was too committed to her position to back down now. In her mind, yielding would be seen as weakness and would undermine her authority for future incidents. "Kyle, this is exactly how scammers operate," she said, speaking loudly enough to ensure her words carried to the assembled crowd. "They hack computers, they forge documents, they count on gate agents being too intimidated to enforce standards. Well, not on my watch." The word intimidated was a poor choice. It suggested that treating passengers with dignity and respect was somehow a sign of weakness rather than basic professionalism. James Thompson's live stream had attracted the attention of several prominent civil rights lawyers who were now actively commenting and sharing the feed. One comment that caught particular attention read, "This is textbook discrimination. Every word they're saying is going to be evidence in the inevitable lawsuit." As if summoned by that comment, 2 airport security officers finally arrived at Gate B12. They were both middle-aged men with the tired expressions of people who had dealt with countless passenger disputes over the years. Their name tags read, Officer Martinez and Officer Johnson. "We got a call about suspicious documentation," Officer Martinez said, looking around the gate area with confusion. The scene he encountered, dozens of passengers with phones out, multiple live streams running 3 airline employees clustered around one passenger, was unlike the typical boarding gate disturbance he was accustomed to handling. Tiffany immediately stepped forward, relief evident in her voice. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly. We have a passenger with questionable documentation attempting to board with what we believe may be a fraudulent first-class ticket." Officer Martinez looked at Alicia, then at the boarding pass in her hand, then at the crowd of passengers who were obviously treating this as something more significant than a routine security matter. "Ma'am," he said to Alicia, his voice professional but cautious, "may I see your identification and boarding documents?" Alicia handed over her passport and boarding pass without comment. Officer Martinez examined both documents carefully, comparing the photo to Alicia's face and checking the boarding pass against some kind of verification app on his phone. After a moment, he looked up with a puzzled expression. "These documents appear to be completely legitimate. The passport is valid. The boarding pass matches our airline database, and there are no fraud indicators." Tiffany's confidence wavered for just a moment before she rallied. "The documents might be authentic, but that doesn't mean they were obtained legitimately. We believe this passenger may have used stolen credit card information to purchase the ticket." Officer Johnson, who had been quietly observing the crowd and the multiple cameras documenting the interaction, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said to Tiffany, "do you have any specific evidence of credit card fraud, or are you basing this accusation on other factors?" The question was pointed and professional, but it put Tiffany in an impossible position. She couldn't admit that her suspicions were based entirely on Alicia's appearance without explicitly acknowledging discrimination. "It's based on experience," Tiffany said, trying to sound authoritative. "After 8 years in this industry, you develop an instinct for these situations." Instinct Officer Johnson repeated his tone, suggesting he understood exactly what kind of instinct they were discussing. Emma's live stream had now attracted over 10,000 viewers, and clips from her stream were being shared across Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook faster than she could track. The story was beginning to break out of social media and attract attention from mainstream news outlets. James Thompson had received direct messages from producers at 3 major news networks asking for permission to use his footage on television. The incident was rapidly evolving from viral social media content to national news story. But for Alicia Davidson, standing at the center of this growing maelstrom, the most important conversation was still happening on her phone with Samantha Torres. "Sam," she said quietly, "it's time." Activate the protocol. Contact Legal Contact Corporate Communications and get me a direct line to the board chairman. It's time they learned exactly who they've been discriminating against. The arrival of airport security should have de-escalated the situation, but instead it seemed to embolden the Monarch Airlines crew members who had convinced themselves they were protecting their company's standards rather than engaging in discrimination. Officer Martinez completed his examination of Alicia's documents and turned to address the assembled group. "These documents are completely legitimate," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the gate area. "I see no evidence of fraud or any violation of airport security protocols." The pronouncement should have ended the confrontation, but Tiffany Parker was too invested in her position to accept that she had been wrong from the beginning. With respect, Officer Tiffany said, her voice taking on the tone of someone who believed she possessed specialized knowledge, that law enforcement lacked document authentication is only one part of passenger verification. There are other factors that we consider when assessing passenger suitability for premium cabin service. Officer Johnson, a 20-year veteran of airport security who had seen every possible variation of passenger conflict, fixed Tiffany with a steady gaze. "Ma'am, could you elaborate on what these other factors might be?" "Because I'm not aware of any airline policy that allows crew members to deny boarding to passengers with valid documentation based on subjective assessments." The question hung in the air like a legal trap waiting to be sprung. Tiffany looked to Miguel and Ashley for support, but both crew members suddenly seemed less certain about their position. Emma Rodriguez, who had been providing continuous commentary to her livestream audience, whispered urgently into her phone camera. The security officer just called out the airline crew for their discriminatory behavior. "This is incredible. Law enforcement is basically asking them to admit they're profiling passengers." Her viewer count had climbed past 12,000, and the story was spreading across platforms at viral speed. The hashtag #MonarchShame was now trending nationally, with users sharing clips from multiple live streams and demanding accountability from the airline. James Thompson's stream had attracted attention from major news outlets, and he was fielding direct messages from CNN, ABC, and NBC requesting permission to use his footage. The incident was rapidly transitioning from social media story to national news event. But the most significant development was happening away from the public eye. David Kim's call to Monarch Airlines corporate headquarters had triggered an emergency response protocol. In the company's crisis management center, executives were watching multiple live streams simultaneously while fielding calls from media outlets and monitoring the explosive growth of negative hashtags across social platforms. At Gate B12, the situation took another turn when Captain Robert Hendricks emerged from the aircraft. At 52 years old, Captain Hendricks was a 25-year veteran of commercial aviation who had built his reputation on maintaining strict operational standards and zero tolerance for passenger disruptions. He had been summoned from the cockpit by Miguel Santos, who had painted the situation as a passenger attempting to board with fraudulent documentation. Captain Hendricks approached the gate area expecting to find a typical boarding irregularity that would require brief crew intervention. Instead, he encountered a scene that looked more like a press conference than a passenger boarding process. Dozens of people with phones out, multiple live streams running, airport security officers looking uncomfortable, and his crew members clustered defensively around one passenger. "What exactly is happening here?" Captain Hendricks asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Tiffany immediately stepped forward, relief evident in her expression. In her mind, the captain's arrival would resolve the situation in her favor and validate her decision to prevent boarding. "Captain, we have a passenger with suspicious documentation attempting to board first class. Despite our efforts to verify her credentials, she continues to insist on accessing the premium cabin." Captain Hendricks looked at Alicia for the first time, taking in her appearance with the same critical assessment that his crew members had employed. His expression hardened as he processed what he saw. "I see," he said, his tone suggesting that he did indeed see exactly what his crew members wanted him to see. And what makes her documentation suspicious? The question was directed at Tiffany, but Officer Martinez answered instead. Sir, I've examined all of her documents thoroughly. Her passport is valid, her boarding pass matches your airline's database, and there are no indicators of fraud or forgery. From a security standpoint, there are no issues with this passenger. Captain Hendricks' expression darkened. He was accustomed to having security officers support crew decisions, not contradict them in front of passengers. Officer, I appreciate your assessment, but airline crew members have broader authority to make determinations about passenger suitability beyond simple document verification. The statement sent a ripple of reaction through the crowd of witnesses. Emma's live stream exploded with comments as viewers reacted to what appeared to be the captain openly endorsing discriminatory passenger screening. David Kim, who had been coordinating with corporate contacts throughout the incident, stepped forward again. Captain, could you specify what authority allows airline crew to deny boarding to passengers with valid documentation based on subjective assessments of suitability? It was the same type of direct, legally focused question that had trapped Tiffany earlier, but Captain Hendricks had decades of experience handling challenges to his authority. Sir, federal aviation regulations grant flight crew broad discretion to ensure flight safety and maintain cabin order. If my crew determines that a passenger may disrupt the cabin environment, I have the authority to deny boarding. And what behavior has this passenger exhibited that suggests she might disrupt the cabin environment? David pressed. Captain Hendricks looked at Alicia again, then at the crowd of passengers documenting the interaction, then back at David. The disruption, he said carefully, appears to be happening right here at the gate. This passenger's insistence on boarding despite legitimate crew concerns has created a disturbance that is delaying departure for all our passengers. It was a clever deflection that attempted to blame Alicia for the situation that had been created entirely by his crew's discriminatory behavior. But the dozens of witnesses who had observed the entire interaction from the beginning weren't fooled. That's complete nonsense, someone called out from the crowd. She hasn't done anything except stand there quietly while your crew harassed her. Captain Hendricks turned toward the voice with the expression of someone who was used to deference and respect, not public contradiction. Sir, I'm going to ask you to watch your language and step back. This is an operational matter that doesn't concern other passengers. But James Thompson, still live streaming to his growing audience, refused to be intimidated. Actually, Captain, this concerns all of us. We're watching your crew discriminate against a passenger based on her appearance, and now you're endorsing that discrimination. This is absolutely our concern as human beings. The live stream comments were moving too fast to read, but the sentiment was clear. Viewers were outraged, not just at the initial discrimination, but at the way it was being compounded by each additional crew member who arrived to support rather than correct the situation. Emma Rodriguez had received messages from several major news outlets requesting interviews. The story was breaking nationally, and she was becoming one of the primary sources of documentation. I've been travel blogging for 3 years, she said to her camera, and I have never seen anything like this. This is open, unapologetic discrimination being defended by the captain himself. Meanwhile, Alicia Davidson continued her quiet conversation with Samantha Torres. Her voice was calm, but those close enough to hear could detect an undercurrent of steel that hadn't been present earlier. Sam, is the legal team ready? Good. What about corporate communications? Excellent. And the board? Perfect. Tell them we're implementing Option 7 effective immediately. Captain Hendricks, who had been focused on the crowd of passengers and hadn't been paying attention to Alicia's phone conversation, made the decision that would ultimately end his career. Ma'am, he said to Alicia, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside and allow legitimate passengers to board. If you continue to disrupt our boarding process, I will have no choice but to request that security escort you from the gate area. The threat was delivered in the tone of an ultimatum. In Captain Hendricks' experience, passengers who were challenged by crew authority typically backed down rather than risk being banned from air travel. But Alicia Davidson was not a typical passenger. She looked up from her phone for the first time since the captain's arrival, meeting his gaze directly. "Captain," she said quietly, "I think you should be very careful about your next decision." There was something in her voice, a calm certainty that didn't match her disheveled appearance, that gave Captain Hendricks pause. But he had committed himself to a course of action in front of dozens of witnesses and multiple live streams. In his mind, backing down now would undermine his authority permanently. "Ma'am, I've made my decision. You have 2 minutes to gather your belongings and leave the gate area voluntarily, or security will escort you out." Emma's live stream audience watched in real time as a commercial airline captain threatened to have a passenger arrested for the crime of holding a valid boarding pass while being black. James Thompson's followers were screenshotting and sharing key moments from the live stream, creating a permanent record of each escalating moment of discrimination. And in Monarch Airlines' corporate crisis center, executives watched their company's reputation implode in real time while frantically trying to establish contact with their crew at JFK. But none of them, not the crew members, not the witnesses, not the security officers, and certainly not the thousands of people watching online, had any idea who they were really dealing with. That was about to change. While the confrontation at Gate B12 continued to escalate in the physical world, a parallel drama was unfolding across social media platforms that would ultimately prove more consequential than anything happening at JFK Airport. Isabella Rose, a 23-year-old lifestyle influencer with 200,000 TikTok followers, had been waiting for her business-class boarding group when she noticed the commotion in the first-class lane. Isabella had built her social media brand on aspirational luxury content, designer fashion hauls, first-class flight reviews, and behind-the-scenes glimpses of what she called rich girl aesthetic. When she saw Alicia Davidson being questioned by airline crew, Isabella's first instinct wasn't sympathy or concern. It was content opportunity. Isabella discreetly positioned herself to get a good angle and began filming what she perceived as a perfect example of people who try too hard for her TikTok audience. Her followers loved content that reinforced social hierarchies and mocked people who didn't understand their proper place in luxury environments. "OMG, guys," Isabella whispered into her phone camera, making sure her voice was quiet enough not to interfere with the ongoing confrontation, but loud enough for her microphone to pick up clearly. "You are not going to believe what I'm witnessing right now at JFK." She turned her camera toward Alicia, zooming in on the stained sweatpants and oversized hoodie. "Someone is literally trying to sneak into first class wearing what looks like they slept in it for a week. The crew is totally onto them, and it's about to get so awkward." Isabella's video began attracting views immediately. Her audience was primed for this type of content, pseudo-voyeuristic glimpses of social missteps that made them feel superior and validated their own status consciousness. Within minutes, her video had gained several hundred likes and dozens of comments. The second-hand embarrassment is real. Why do people think they can just fake their way into luxury? Security needs to get involved before she causes more drama. This is why I only fly private now. But Isabella's content was about to collide with the more serious documentation being provided by Emma Rodriguez and James Thompson, creating a social media perfect storm that would expose not just Monarch Airlines' discriminatory practices, but the broader cultural attitudes that enabled and celebrated such discrimination. Emma's travel blog audience was very different from Isabella's lifestyle followers. Emma's viewers were diverse, internationally minded travelers who were drawn to her authentic reviews and cultural commentary. When Emma's livestream began documenting what was clearly racial profiling, her audience responded with outrage and demands for accountability. The comment section of Emma's stream had become a real-time organizing space. Someone needs to get Monarch's corporate number and flood their phones. This needs to be sent to every news outlet immediately. That captain just admitted to discrimination on camera. Where is the NAACP? Someone tag them. Meanwhile, James Thompson's corporate network was amplifying the story through professional channels. His Twitter followers included journalists, lawyers, civil rights activists, and business leaders who understood the legal and reputational implications of what they were witnessing. James had started using specific hashtags that were designed to attract attention from news organizations and civil rights groups. Airline discrimination, corporate racism, JFK incident, and Monarch shame were all gaining traction across multiple platforms. The intersection of these different social media ecosystems created an explosive viral effect. Isabella's mocking content was being discovered by Emma and James's audiences, who responded with fury at her celebration of discrimination. Isabella's video was being screen recorded and reshared with commentary that exposed the callousness of her perspective. This influencer is literally celebrating racism, one viral tweet read alongside a screen recording of Isabella's video. She thinks it's funny that a black woman is being humiliated by airline crew. Isabella, monitoring her notifications, began to realize that her content was being shared in ways she hadn't intended. Her mentions were filling with angry responses from people who had seen her video through Emma's and James's networks. But instead of recognizing that she had misjudged the situation, Isabella doubled down. She created a follow-up video that would ultimately destroy her social media career. "Guys, some of you are taking this way too seriously," she said into her camera, speaking from the bathroom where she had retreated to avoid the growing crowd at the gate. "It's not about race, okay? It's about standards. First class is expensive for a reason. It's supposed to be exclusive. If you can't dress the part, maybe you don't belong there." The follow-up video was immediately screen recorded and shared across platforms. Within hours, Isabella Rose had become the face of privilege and discrimination, her words providing a perfect example of how wealthy young people justified and perpetuated exclusionary practices. Major Twitter accounts began sharing her videos with scathing commentary. This is what privilege looks like, celebrating discrimination and calling it standards. Imagine being so entitled that you think clothing determines human worth. She really said, "Dress the part," and thought she was making a valid point. Back at Gate B12, the social media explosion was beginning to impact the real-world situation. Airport security officers were receiving calls from their supervisors asking about the JFK discrimination incident that was trending nationally. Monarch Airlines' corporate headquarters was being flooded with calls from journalists and civil rights organizations demanding comment. Emma Rodriguez had been contacted directly by producers from CNN, MSNBC, and ABC News requesting permission to use her live stream footage on television. The story was transitioning from social media phenomenon to mainstream news coverage in real time. "I'm getting calls from news networks," Emma announced to her live stream audience. "This story is going national, guys. What we're witnessing right here is about to be on every news channel in America." James Thompson's stream had attracted attention from prominent civil rights lawyers who were providing real-time legal commentary in his chat. One comment that gained particular attention read, "This is a textbook civil rights violation. Every word these employees have said is admissible evidence. The airline is going to face massive liability." The hashtag Monarch Shame had begun trending not just in the United States, but internationally. Social media users in the UK, where Monarch Airlines was headquartered, were expressing outrage and calling for boycotts. Meanwhile, Isabella Rose's follower count was beginning to drop as users discovered her discriminatory content. Brands that had previously worked with her began quietly removing her from campaign rosters. Her attempt to capitalize on someone else's humiliation was backfiring catastrophically. But the most significant development was happening behind the scenes. David Kim's corporate contacts had shared the live stream footage with civil rights organizations, legal advocacy groups, and corporate accountability watchdogs. The incident was being documented and preserved by multiple organizations that specialized in fighting discrimination and holding companies accountable for their employees' actions. In Monarch Airlines' Corporate Crisis Center, executives were watching their company's reputation implode in real time across every social media platform simultaneously. The crisis management team was fielding calls from international news outlets while watching their stock price begin to fluctuate as investors reacted to the viral story. But perhaps most importantly, the social media documentation was creating an irrefutable record of discrimination that would be impossible for the company to deny or minimize. Multiple angles, multiple platforms, multiple witnesses, and thousands of viewers had created a permanent archive of corporate bias in action. The crew members at Gate B12 were still operating under the assumption that they were dealing with a simple passenger dispute. They had no idea that their words and actions were being broadcast to hundreds of thousands of people worldwide, or that their names and faces were becoming symbols of institutional racism. That ignorance was about to end in the most dramatic way possible. Captain Hendrix's 2-minute ultimatum was counting down like a bomb timer, creating tension that was being felt not just at Gate B12, but across social media platforms where hundreds of thousands of people were watching the confrontation unfold in real time. Airport security officers Martinez and Johnson found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position. They had been called to handle what was described as a passenger with fraudulent documentation, but their investigation had revealed no evidence of fraud or policy violation. Instead, they were witnessing what appeared to be clear discrimination being defended by airline employees who seemed oblivious to the legal implications of their actions. Captain Officer Johnson said, his voice careful and professional. "I need to clarify something for my report. Are you requesting that we remove this passenger based on a specific security violation, or are you asking us to enforce what appears to be a subjective assessment of passenger suitability?" It was a carefully worded question that would force Captain Hendrix to either identify a legitimate security concern or admit that he was requesting the removal of a passenger based on discriminatory criteria. Captain Hendrix, feeling the pressure of hundreds of eyes and dozens of camera phones documenting his every word, chose to double down on his authority rather than acknowledge the legal trap he was walking into. "Officer, I am invoking my authority as pilot in command to determine that this passenger's presence represents a potential disruption to cabin safety and order. Federal aviation regulations grant me broad discretion in making such determinations." Officer Martinez and Officer Johnson exchanged glances. Both were experienced law enforcement professionals who understood the difference between legitimate security concerns and discrimination disguised as safety protocols. Sir Officer Martinez said, "Could you specify what behavior this passenger has exhibited that leads you to conclude she represents a safety risk? Because our observation has been that she has remained calm and compliant throughout this entire interaction." Emma Rodriguez, still live-streaming to her massive audience, provided commentary on this exchange. "The security officers are basically asking the captain to prove his discrimination," she whispered into her camera. "They're not buying his safety excuse." James Thompson's stream had attracted the attention of several prominent civil rights attorneys who were providing real-time legal analysis in the chat. One comment that gained significant traction read, "Captain is about to commit federal civil rights violations on camera. This is going to be an expensive lesson for Monarch Airlines." Meanwhile, Alicia Davidson continued her conversation with Samantha Torres, her voice quiet, but increasingly authoritative. "Sam, I need you to patch me through to legal right now. Yes, I understand they're in emergency session. Tell them their CEO is standing at Gate B12 at JFK being discriminated against by her own employees. No, that's not a hypothetical. Tiffany Parker, Ashley Ford, and Miguel Santos stood behind Captain Hendrix, their confidence bolstered by having the highest-ranking crew member supporting their position. In their minds, the captain's arrival had validated their assessment and would bring this embarrassing situation to a quick conclusion. But David Kim, who had been monitoring social media responses while documenting the incident, stepped forward with information that changed the entire dynamic. Captain David said, his voice cutting through the ambient tension. "I think you should know that this incident is currently trending nationally on social media. Your conversation is being live-streamed to hundreds of thousands of viewers, and major news outlets are already requesting interviews about Monarch Airlines' passenger policies." The information hit Captain Hendricks like a physical blow. He looked around the gate area with new eyes, suddenly understanding that the phones pointed in his direction weren't just casual passenger documentation. They were creating a permanent public record of everything he said and did. "That's..." he started to say, then stopped as the implications began to sink in. Emma's live stream audience had climbed past 15,000 viewers, and clips from her stream were being shared across Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook faster than anyone could track. The hashtag #MonarchShame was trending in the top 10 nationally alongside airline discrimination and JFK racism. Isabella Rose, who had retreated to the airport bathroom to film her follow-up TikTok defending the crew's actions, was discovering that her content was being shared in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her mentions were filling with angry responses from people who were appalled by her celebration of discrimination. "Wait," Isabella said into her phone camera, her voice becoming uncertain for the first time. "People are saying the woman being questioned is actually, important? That can't be right. Look at her clothes." But social media users had begun conducting their own research into the incident. Aviation industry insiders were beginning to share information about Monarch Airlines' corporate structure. Business journalists were pulling up public records about the company's ownership and leadership. And in Monarch Airlines' corporate crisis center, executives were watching their carefully constructed crisis management plans crumble as the situation spiraled beyond their control. Samantha Torres, Alicia's executive assistant, was coordinating responses from her office in London while simultaneously managing calls from Monarch's board of directors' legal team and communications department. Alicia Samantha said through the phone, her voice tight with urgency. "Corporate has been trying to reach their crew at JFK for the past 15 minutes. The captain isn't responding to calls. Legal wants to know if you want them to intervene directly." Alicia looked around the gate area, taking in the crew members who had spent the past hour humiliating her, the security officers who were clearly uncomfortable with what they were being asked to do, the dozens of passengers documenting every moment of her degradation. "No," Alicia said quietly. "Let them finish. I want everyone to see exactly what Monarch Airlines culture looks like when people think no one important is watching." Captain Hendricks was facing a decision that would define the rest of his career. He could acknowledge that his crew had made a mistake and allow Alicia to board with an apology, potentially undermining his authority but limiting the damage to his reputation. Or he could follow through on his ultimatum and have security remove a passenger with valid documentation, creating a permanent record of discrimination that would follow him forever. His pride made the choice for him. "Officer Martinez." Captain Hendricks said, his voice carrying false confidence. "I am formally requesting that you escort this passenger from the gate area for disrupting airline operations and failing to comply with crew instructions." The words created a moment of stunned silence among the witnesses. Even passengers who hadn't been paying close attention turned to stare. Emma's live stream chat exploded with outraged comments. James Thompson's followers began immediately screenshotting and sharing the moment when a commercial airline captain formally requested the arrest of a passenger whose only crime was existing while black. But Officer Martinez didn't move to comply with the request. "Sir," he said instead, "I need to advise you that requesting the removal of a passenger with valid documentation based on discriminatory criteria could constitute a federal civil rights violation. Are you certain you want to proceed with this request?" It was the final warning, the last opportunity for Captain Hendricks to step back from a decision that would destroy his career and potentially expose him to personal legal liability. He looked at Alicia Davidson one more time, seeing only what he had seen from the beginning, a woman in cheap clothes who didn't belong in his first-class cabin. "Officer," he said firmly, "I am making a formal request for passenger removal. Please proceed." And in that moment, Alicia Davidson smiled for the first time since entering the terminal. The formal request for passenger removal created an electric tension that seemed to charge the very air around Gate B12. Officer Martinez looked at Officer Johnson, both men clearly uncomfortable with the position they were being placed in by Captain Hendricks's escalating demands. "Sir," Officer Johnson said carefully before we proceed with any removal, "I need to document the specific violation that justifies this action. Can you provide me with the exact policy or regulation that this passenger has violated?" It was a reasonable request that should have been easy to answer, but Captain Hendricks found himself in the impossible position of trying to articulate discriminatory criteria without explicitly acknowledging discrimination. The violation. Captain Hendricks said, speaking slowly as he tried to construct a legally defensible justification, is disruption of airline operations and failure to comply with crew instructions regarding proper documentation verification procedures. Officer Martinez consulted his notes. "Sir, according to my observations, this passenger has complied with all crew instructions. She provided documentation when requested, submitted to verification procedures, and has remained calm and cooperative throughout the interaction. What specific instruction has she failed to follow?" Emma Rodriguez, whose live stream audience had grown to over 18,000 viewers, provided real-time commentary for her followers. "The security officers are literally forcing the captain to admit he has no legitimate reason for this removal. This is incredible documentation of how discrimination gets challenged by actual law enforcement." Her audience was responding with a mixture of outrage and admiration for the officer's professional handling of an obviously discriminatory situation. The hashtag "Thank You Officer Martinez" had begun trending alongside the broader incident hashtags. Meanwhile, the passenger crowd at Gate B12 had divided into distinct camps. Some travelers, particularly those holding business and first-class tickets, seemed to support the crew's actions. They whispered among themselves about maintaining standards and ensuring that premium services remained exclusive. "I didn't pay $12,000 to sit next to someone who looks homeless." One well-dressed woman muttered to her companion, apparently forgetting that her voice would carry in the increasingly quiet gate area. "Exactly," agreed a man in an expensive suit. "There has to be some screening process, otherwise anyone could just walk into first class." But other passengers were becoming increasingly vocal in their opposition to what they were witnessing. The demographic divide was stark. Younger passengers, people of color, and international travelers were largely supporting Alicia, while older, wealthy-appearing passengers tended to side with the crew. A young black businessman, who had been quietly observing the entire incident, finally reached his breaking point. "This is disgusting," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the gate area. "I've been watching this woman get harassed for an hour because of how she's dressed. She has a valid ticket. She's done nothing wrong. And now you want to have her arrested? This is exactly why I don't fly Monarch anymore." His words sparked a ripple of conversation among the assembled passengers. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable at having the racial subtext of the situation stated so explicitly. Tiffany Parker, feeling emboldened by Captain Hendricks' support and the apparent backing of several first-class passengers, decided to make her position even clearer. "Sir," she said to the black businessman, "I understand you may feel sympathy for this individual, but you have to understand that we have standards to maintain. Our first-class passengers expect a certain level of appropriateness in their cabin environment." The word appropriateness hung in the air like a slur. James Thompson's live stream chat erupted with comments. Did she really just say appropriateness? Appropriateness? The racism is right there. Screenshot that quote. She just admitted to profiling passengers. This is going to be evidence in the lawsuit. David Kim, who had been coordinating with civil rights organizations and media outlets throughout the incident, stepped forward again. "Ms. Parker," he said, reading her name tag, "could you define what you mean by appropriateness in this context? Because it sounds like you're suggesting that passengers can be denied service based on subjective assessments of their appearance." Tiffany's face flushed red as she realized she had walked into another legal trap. But instead of backing down, she doubled down on her position. "I mean that first-class service attracts a certain clientele with certain expectations. Our passengers invest in a premium experience, and part of that experience is the assurance that everyone in the cabin meets basic standards of presentation and behavior. And who determines these basic standards, David pressed. Are they written down somewhere? Are they applied equally to all passengers, regardless of race? The questions were designed to expose the discriminatory nature of the crew's actions, and they were succeeding brilliantly. But they were also creating a record of explicit bias that would be impossible for Monarch Airlines to explain or defend. Miguel Santos, perhaps sensing that the situation was spiraling beyond salvage, tried a different approach. "Look," he said, addressing the crowd of passengers rather than the security officers. "This isn't about race. This is about fraud prevention. We see attempts to hack upgrade computers all the time. Someone who looks like they can't afford first class suddenly shows up with a premium ticket. That raises red flags." The statement was intended to provide a race-neutral explanation for their suspicions, but it actually made the discrimination more explicit by openly admitting that they profiled passengers based on assumptions about their economic status and appearance. Ashley Ford nodded in agreement with Miguel's explanation. "Exactly. It's basic security protocol. If something doesn't add up, we investigate. That's how we protect legitimate passengers from fraud." But Officer Johnson had heard enough circular logic and discriminatory justifications. "Let me be clear about something," he said, his voice cutting through the various conversations happening around the gate. "You've spent the last hour describing this passenger as suspicious, inappropriate, fraudulent, and disruptive. But in my observation, the only disruptive behavior has come from airline employees who have refused to allow a passenger with valid documentation to board her flight." Emma's live stream audience cheered the officer's statement in the chat. James Thompson's followers were sharing clips of Officer Johnson's words across multiple platforms. The social media documentation was creating a permanent record of law enforcement officials contradicting airline discrimination in real time. Isabella Rose, who had been monitoring her notifications while hiding in the bathroom, finally understood that her content celebrating the crew's actions had backfired catastrophically. Her follower count was dropping by the hundreds as users discovered her discriminatory videos. Brands were quietly removing her from campaign rosters. Her attempt to gain clout by mocking someone else's humiliation had destroyed her social media career. But in the gate area, Captain Hendricks was still committed to his course of action. The presence of security officers, the crowd of witnesses, and the national social media attention hadn't changed his fundamental assessment of the situation. "Officer," he said to Martinez, "I appreciate your perspective, but I have 30 years of experience in aviation safety and passenger management. I'm making a formal determination that this passenger represents a potential security risk based on the totality of the circumstances. And what circumstances are those specifically?" Officer Martinez asked, pen poised over his incident report. Captain Hendricks looked around the gate area, suddenly aware that hundreds of people were hanging on his every word, and that his response would be documented permanently across multiple platforms. "The circumstances," he said carefully, "include suspicious documentation patterns, failure to meet expected passenger profiles for premium cabin service, and the disruption created by her insistence on boarding despite legitimate crew concerns." It was bureaucratic language designed to obscure discriminatory intent, but everyone present understood exactly what he was saying. And more importantly, everyone present understood that they were witnessing a textbook example of how institutional racism operated through coded language and subjective professional judgment. Alicia Davidson, still holding her phone conversation with Samantha Torres, finally looked up and made direct eye contact with Captain Hendricks. "Captain," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "Are you absolutely certain you want to have me arrested?" There was something in her tone, a calm certainty that didn't match her disheveled appearance, that should have given him pause. But Captain Hendricks had invested too much authority in his position to back down now. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "you've been given multiple opportunities to resolve this situation peacefully. You chose not to cooperate. Officer Martinez, please proceed with the removal." And as Officer Martinez reluctantly approached Alicia Davidson to comply with the captain's formal request, she spoke one final sentence into her phone that would change everything. "Sam," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel, "it's time. Tell them exactly who they're about to arrest." The moment had arrived that Captain Hendricks had been building toward since he first laid eyes on Alicia Davidson. Officer Martinez approached with obvious reluctance, his hand resting uncomfortably on his radio as he prepared to carry out what he clearly believed was an unjust removal. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said softly, his voice barely audible to the crowd of witnesses. "I'm very sorry about this, but I need to ask you to come with me." The apology was unprofessional and revealing. Security officers didn't typically express regret when removing passengers who posed legitimate safety threats. His words confirmed what everyone present already knew, that they were witnessing the enforcement of discrimination rather than legitimate security protocols. Emma Rodriguez's live stream had become must-see viewing for over 20,000 people worldwide. Her audience included journalists, civil rights activists, legal professionals, and ordinary citizens who were transfixed by this real-time documentation of institutional racism. "This is it," Emma whispered into her camera, her voice tight with emotion. "They're actually going to arrest her for the crime of being black in first class. This is happening in 2024 in America, on camera." James Thompson's stream had attracted attention from major news networks. CNN, ABC, and NBC producers were already in contact with him about using his footage on television. The incident was transitioning from viral social media content to breaking news coverage on major networks. The broader Monarch Airlines organization was in complete crisis mode. In their corporate headquarters in London, executives were fielding calls from international news outlets while watching their stock price fluctuate in real time as investors reacted to the viral footage. Board members were demanding answers about how a simple passenger boarding process had turned into a public relations catastrophe that was trending globally. The crisis management team had prepared for many scenarios, but they had never anticipated having to explain why their crew was having a passenger arrested for holding a valid ticket. Back at gate B12, Tiffany Parker watched with satisfaction as security finally prepared to remove the passenger she had been trying to get rid of for over an hour. In her mind, this vindicated her professional judgment and would serve as a warning to future passengers who tried to game the upgrade computer. "Thank you, Officer Tiffany," said her voice carrying a tone of professional relief. "I know this is never easy, but maintaining cabin standards is essential for passenger safety and satisfaction." Captain Hendricks nodded in agreement, his expression suggesting that he viewed this as an unfortunate but necessary conclusion to a regrettable incident. Miguel Santos and Ashley Ford flanked their senior colleagues, their body language conveying solidarity and mutual support. They had convinced themselves that they were protecting their company's reputation rather than destroying it. But as Officer Martinez reluctantly began to recite the standard language for airport removal, Alicia Davidson's phone conversation with Samantha Torres reached its conclusion. Sam Alicia said, her voice suddenly carrying an authority that hadn't been present throughout the entire confrontation. "Patch me through to the board chairman. Now." The change in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time since entering the terminal, Alicia Davidson sounded like someone accustomed to being obeyed rather than questioned. Samantha Torres, working from Monarch Airlines corporate headquarters in London, had spent the past hour coordinating with legal teams, communications specialists, and board members as they watched their company's reputation implode in real time across every social media platform. Alicia Samantha said, her voice carrying clearly through the phone's speaker, "Sir Geoffrey is standing by. Legal wants to know if you're ready to proceed with Option 7. Option 7 meant nothing to the crew members, security officers, or passengers listening to the conversation, but it was corporate code for the nuclear option, the complete exposure of executive ownership when discrimination had reached levels that threatened the entire organization. "Yes," Alicia said simply. "Execute immediately." Officer Martinez, who had been in the process of asking Alicia to gather her belongings for removal, stopped mid-sentence as he registered the change in her demeanor and the corporate terminology she was using. David Kim, who had been documenting the incident for civil rights organizations, noticed the shift immediately. As a technology executive himself, he recognized the language of corporate crisis management when he heard it. Officer Martinez David said urgently, "I think you should pause the removal process. Something significant is about to happen here." But Captain Hendricks was too committed to his course of action to be deterred by mysterious phone conversations or last-minute interventions from passengers. "Officer, please proceed," Captain Hendricks said firmly. "We've already been delayed too long by this situation." However, before Officer Martinez could continue with the removal, 3 new figures appeared at Gate B12. They were wearing crisp suits with Monarch Airlines corporate identification badges, and they moved with the purposeful authority of people accustomed to handling crisis situations. The lead figure was a tall woman with silver hair who approached the assembled group with the confidence of someone who outranked everyone present. Her badge identified her as Sarah Chen, Corporate Security Director. Behind her were 2 men in similar attire whose badges indicated they were from Monarch's legal and communications departments. Their presence suggested that whatever was about to happen had been coordinated at the highest levels of the organization. Emma's live stream audience exploded with speculation about why corporate executives would respond personally to what appeared to be a routine passenger removal. The viewer count climbed past 25,000 as word spread that something unprecedented was about to unfold. Sarah Chen approached Captain Hendricks with an expression that suggested she was not pleased with what she had observed during her approach to the gate. "Captain Hendricks," she said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the terminal, "I need you to step aside immediately. This situation is now under direct corporate management." The intervention was unprecedented. Corporate security directors didn't typically appear at gate-level passenger disputes unless something extraordinary was happening. Captain Hendricks, confused but still confident in his authority, faced the corporate representative with the same certainty he had shown throughout the incident. "Ms. Chen," he said, reading her badge, "I appreciate corporate's interest, but this is an operational safety matter under my direct authority as pilot in command. I've made a determination that this passenger should be removed for the safety and security of the flight." Sarah Chen looked at Captain Hendricks with an expression that suggested she was viewing someone who had just destroyed his career without realizing it. "Captain," she said quietly, "do you have any idea who you've just requested to have arrested?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. For the first time since the confrontation began, Captain Hendricks looked uncertain. Something in the corporate representative's tone suggested that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Tiffany Parker, Miguel Santos, and Ashley Ford exchanged glances, suddenly aware that the situation was taking an unexpected turn that might not conclude in their favor. And Alicia Davidson, still holding her phone but no longer speaking into it, smiled for the second time since entering the terminal. Sarah Chen reached into her briefcase and withdrew a leather portfolio containing documents that would change everything the witnesses at Gate B12 thought they knew about the situation they had been observing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah Chen announced, her voice carrying clearly through the gate area, I need to inform you that you have been witnessing the discrimination of Alicia Davidson, the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer and majority owner of Monarch Airlines." The words hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Officer Martinez froze mid-motion. Captain Hendricks' face went pale. Tiffany Parker's mouth fell open in shock. The passengers who had been filming immediately understood that they had documented something far more significant than a typical discrimination incident. Emma Rodriguez's live stream exploded with comments as her audience processed the revelation. "Wait, what, the owner, she owns the airline, holy crud. Those employees are so fired. This is the greatest plot twist in history." James Thompson's Twitter stream was being shared and reshared at viral velocity as users recognized they were witnessing a historic moment of corporate accountability. Sarah Chen continued opening the portfolio to reveal official documentation. Ms. Davidson inherited controlling interest in Monarch Airlines following the death of her father, Theodore Davidson, the company's founder, 48 hours ago. She has been traveling to London to finalize funeral arrangements and assume her position as CEO. The information recontextualized everything that had happened over the past hour. The suspicious passenger in cheap clothes was actually the grieving daughter of the company founder traveling in comfortable clothing after spending 2 days at her father's deathbed. The fraudulent ticket had been purchased with money from the family fortune that had built the airline itself. Captain Hendricks staggered backward as if he had been struck. In 30 years of aviation, he had made countless decisions about passenger suitability, but he had never discriminated against the company owner herself. That's impossible," Tiffany Parker whispered, her voice barely audible. "Look at her clothes. Look at how she's dressed." Alicia Davidson finally stood up from her seat, her posture straightening as she fully assumed the authority that her inheritance had granted her. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet power of someone who owned everything around her. "Ms. Parker," Alicia said, "would you like to explain to me why my employee just said that my appearance makes my ownership impossible?" The question was delivered with surgical precision. Tiffany had just provided a perfect example of the discriminatory assumptions that had driven the entire incident. Officer Martinez stepped back from the removal process entirely, his professional instincts telling him that he was now dealing with a potential federal civil rights violation involving corporate executives. David Kim, who had been documenting the incident for civil rights organizations, immediately understood the legal implications of what they had witnessed. A company's own employees had discriminated against the company owner based solely on racial profiling and class assumptions. Miguel Santos and Ashley Ford stood frozen, their minds struggling to process the career-ending mistake they had just made. They had spent an hour mocking and humiliating the person who now controlled their employment, their benefits, their professional futures. Isabella Rose, still monitoring the situation from the airport bathroom where she had been hiding, watched her phone notifications explode as users discovered that she had been celebrating discrimination against one of America's youngest black female CEOs. Emma's live stream audience had grown to over 30,000 viewers as news of the revelation spread across social media platforms. The story was transitioning from viral content to major news coverage as journalists recognized the historic significance of the documentation. Sarah Chen approached Officer Martinez with additional documentation. "Officer, Ms. Davidson will not be pursuing criminal charges against your department, but she will be filing formal complaints against the airline employees who violated her civil rights." The legal protection offered to law enforcement was strategic. It ensured that security officers would provide accurate testimony about what they had witnessed, rather than attempting to cover up the incident to protect themselves. Captain Hendricks found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "Ms. Davidson, I had no idea. If I had known." Alicia turned to face him directly, her expression calm but steel hard. "Captain Hendricks, you had no idea about what exactly? That I was your boss. Because if you had known I was just another black passenger, your behavior would have been acceptable. The question exposed the fundamental flaw in any apology based on her identity rather than the wrongness of discrimination itself. Captain Hendricks had no answer that wouldn't confirm his racist assumptions. James Thompson's live stream had attracted the attention of major news networks who were now requesting exclusive interviews. The incident was becoming a landmark case study in corporate discrimination and accountability. Tiffany Parker, perhaps beginning to understand the magnitude of her career-ending mistake, attempted damage control. Ms. Davidson, I was simply following standard security protocols. We have to verify passenger credentials to prevent fraud. Alicia looked at Tiffany with an expression of cold amusement. Ms. Parker, which standard security protocol allows crew members to call passengers trash, loud enough for witnesses to hear the specific quote reference made, Tiffany realized that every word she had spoken during the incident had been heard and documented. There would be no plausible deniability about her motivations or behavior. Sarah Chen handed Officer Martinez a business card. Officer, our legal department will be in touch to provide formal witness statements. We appreciate your professional handling of this situation. The corporate protection extended to airport security was designed to ensure their cooperation in documenting the discrimination that had occurred. By treating law enforcement as allies rather than adversaries, Monarch's legal team was building an unassailable case against their own employees. Emma Rodriguez provided real-time commentary to her massive audience. I am literally witnessing corporate accountability happening in real time. The CEO is confronting the employees who discriminated against her. This is unprecedented. David Kim approached Alicia directly. Ms. Davidson, I've been documenting this incident for civil rights organizations. Your employees provided textbook examples of racial profiling and class discrimination. This footage will be valuable for legal proceedings. Alicia nodded graciously. Thank you, Mr. Kim. Your documentation has been essential for establishing the facts of what happened here. The exchange established Alicia as someone who valued accountability and transparency rather than corporate cover-ups. Her willingness to embrace documentation of discrimination against her own company demonstrated a commitment to reform that would define her leadership. Ashley Ford and Miguel Santos remained silent, understanding that anything they said would only provide additional evidence of their participation in discriminating against the company owner. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Alicia Davidson looked around the gate area at all the passengers who had witnessed her humiliation and degradation. I want everyone here to understand something, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet terminal. What happened here today wasn't about me being the CEO. This was about human dignity and basic respect that every passenger deserves, regardless of their appearance or background. The statement reframed the incident from a story about corporate comeuppance to a broader lesson about civil rights and equality. Alicia was using her platform not for personal vindication, but for social justice education. Emma's audience responded with overwhelming support for her message. Comments flooded the live stream. She's using her power for good. This is how you handle discrimination. What a leader, focusing on justice, not just her own situation. And as Alicia Davidson prepared to board the aircraft that she now owned, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something historic. Not just the exposure of workplace discrimination, but the birth of a new kind of corporate leadership that prioritized justice over profits. The revelation of Alicia Davidson's identity had transformed Gate B12 from a site of discrimination into a courtroom where justice would be administered swiftly and publicly. Sarah Chen opened a second portfolio containing termination documents that had been prepared during the corporate emergency response to the viral incident. Effective immediately, Sarah Chen announced, her voice carrying the authority of corporate justice. The following Monarch Airlines employees are terminated for violation of civil rights policies, discriminatory conduct, and damage to corporate reputation. The formal language of corporate accountability was about to become very personal for the crew members who had spent an hour humiliating their company's owner. Tiffany Parker, Sarah Chen read from the official documentation, "You are terminated for racial profiling, discriminatory denial of service use of derogatory language toward passengers, and abuse of authority. Your employment with Monarch Airlines is ended effective immediately." Tiffany's face went through a range of emotions: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally devastating recognition of what she had lost. In 8 years with Monarch, she had built a career in premium airline service. She had earned respect from colleagues, authority over passengers, and a salary that supported a comfortable lifestyle. All of it was gone because she had looked at a black woman in comfortable clothes and decided she didn't belong in first class. "Security will escort you from the premises," Sarah Chen continued. "Your badge keys and access credentials are immediately revoked. You are prohibited from entering any Monarch Airlines property pending completion of civil rights violation investigations." Emma Rodriguez's live stream audience watched in real time as corporate accountability was administered publicly and immediately. The viewer count had climbed past 35,000 as news of the incident spread across social media platforms. Miguel Santos, Sarah Chen, continued consulting her documentation. "You are terminated for participation in discriminatory conduct, violation of passenger dignity standards, and public statements that bring discredit to the company." Miguel, who had been confident in his professional judgment just minutes before, now faced the reality that his agreement with Tiffany's discrimination had cost him his career in aviation. His statements about passenger profiles and cabin standards were now documented evidence of institutional bias. Ashley Ford, "You are terminated for discriminatory commentary, unprofessional conduct, and violation of company policies regarding respectful passenger treatment." Ashley's brief moment of joining the discrimination against Alicia had destroyed her 3-year career with Monarch. Her comments about Goodwill Clothing and her support for denying service based on appearance were now part of a permanent record that would follow her to any future employer in the airline industry. James Thompson's Twitter stream had become a primary source for major news outlets covering the story. His documentation was being shared by CNN, ABC, and NBC as they prepared breaking news coverage of the unprecedented corporate accountability. But the most significant termination was yet to come. Captain Robert Hendricks, Sarah Chen, said, her voice taking on an even more serious tone. "You are terminated for violation of federal civil rights laws, abuse of pilot-in-command authority, and conduct that exposes the company to significant legal liability." Captain Hendricks's termination carried implications far beyond losing a job. As pilot-in-command, his discriminatory actions potentially violated federal aviation regulations and civil rights laws. His pilot's license could be reviewed by the FAA. His ability to work in aviation anywhere in the world was now in question. 30 years of building a career in commercial aviation had been destroyed by his decision to discriminate against a passenger based on her appearance. David Kim, who had been coordinating with civil rights organizations throughout the incident, approached Sarah Chen with contact information for legal advocacy groups. Ms. Chen David said several civil rights organizations want to ensure that this incident is documented properly for potential federal investigation. They're particularly interested in whether this represents a pattern of discrimination at Monarch. Sarah Chen accepted the contact information professionally. "Mr. Kim, thank you for your advocacy. Ms. Davidson is committed to full transparency and cooperation with any civil rights investigations." The exchange established that the company's new leadership would embrace accountability rather than attempting to cover up discriminatory practices. Officer Martinez and Officer Johnson, who had been uncomfortable with the removal request from the beginning, were now providing detailed incident reports to their supervisors about the discrimination they had witnessed. "Ms. Davidson, Officer Martinez said, I want to apologize for the position you were placed in today. Your treatment by airline employees was unacceptable, and we're grateful you're not pursuing action against airport security." Alicia's response was gracious, but focused on broader principles rather than personal vindication. "Officer Martinez, thank you for your professionalism. you and Officer Johnson conducted yourselves with integrity throughout a very difficult situation. The problem was never with airport security. It was with airline employees who forgot that respect should never depend on appearance or assumptions. Emma's live stream audience responded positively to Alicia's leadership approach. She's not vindictive. She's focused on justice. This is what real leadership looks like. She's building bridges, not burning them. Meanwhile, Sophia Martinez and Brad Wilson, the check-in agents who had started Alicia's humiliation at the Elite Services counter, were receiving termination calls from corporate headquarters. Sophia answered her phone to hear Sarah Chen's voice delivering the news that would end her 3-year career with Monarch. Sophia Martinez, you are terminated for discriminatory conduct at passenger check-in, use of derogatory language, and violation of passenger respect policies. Please surrender your access credentials to airport security immediately. Brad Wilson received a similar call. His employment ended for participating in discrimination and failing to provide appropriate customer service to passengers regardless of appearance. The swift termination of every employee who had participated in discriminating against Alicia sent a clear message that the company's new leadership would not tolerate bias or prejudice at any level. Isabella Rose, still monitoring the situation from her bathroom hiding place, watched her social media career implode as users discovered her videos celebrating discrimination against one of America's youngest black female CEOs. Her follower count was dropping by the thousands as brands canceled partnerships and sponsorship deals. Her attempt to gain clout by mocking someone else's humiliation had backfired catastrophically. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the message that the immediate termination sent to Monarch Airlines employees worldwide. In corporate offices, airport lounges, aircraft cabins, and maintenance facilities across the globe, employees were receiving emergency communications about the JFK incident and its consequences. The message was clear: discrimination would be met with immediate termination regardless of seniority or position. The company's new leadership prioritized civil rights over employee protection. Sarah Chen approached Alicia with the final documentation. Ms. Davidson, all terminations have been executed. Legal is preparing comprehensive civil rights violation reports, and communications is coordinating with media outlets to ensure accurate reporting of the company's response. Alicia nodded, but her focus remained on the broader implications rather than the specific punishments. Sarah, she said, I want a comprehensive review of hiring practices, training programs, and corporate culture initiatives. What happened today wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of deeper problems that need to be addressed. The commitment to comprehensive reform, rather than simply punishing individual actors, demonstrated that Alicia understood the difference between accountability and actual change. As the terminated employees were escorted from the gate area by security, the passengers who had witnessed the entire incident began to understand that they had observed something unprecedented in corporate America: immediate public accountability for discrimination at the highest levels. Emma Rodriguez provided final commentary to her massive audience. I've just witnessed the most swift and complete response to workplace discrimination I've ever seen. This is how corporate leadership should handle bias and prejudice. And as Alicia Davidson finally prepared to board her aircraft, everyone present knew they had witnessed not just justice, but the emergence of a new standard for corporate accountability in America. As the terminated employees were escorted from Gate B12, Alicia Davidson faced a decision that would define her leadership and her company's future. She could board her aircraft and handle the aftermath privately through corporate channels, or she could use this moment to make a public commitment to change that would set the standard for airline industry accountability. She chose transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, Alicia announced, her voice carrying clearly through the gate area where dozens of passengers remained transfixed by what they had witnessed. Before I board this aircraft, I want to make a commitment to every person who has documented today's events. Emma Rodriguez immediately adjusted her live stream to capture Alicia's statement, understanding that whatever came next would likely be historic. Her audience had grown to over 40,000 viewers, as news of the incident spread across multiple platforms. James Thompson's Twitter stream had attracted the attention of major news networks who were preparing to use his footage for breaking news coverage. The incident was transitioning from viral social media content to national news story. What happened here today, Alicia continued, was not an isolated incident. It was the result of corporate culture that prioritized exclusivity over equality, comfort over justice, and assumptions over dignity. David Kim, who had been coordinating with civil rights organizations throughout the incident, immediately recognized that Alicia was about to announce policy changes that could impact the entire airline industry. Effective immediately, Alicia said Monarch Airlines is implementing the Dignity Initiative, a comprehensive program designed to ensure that every passenger receives respectful treatment regardless of their appearance, background, or economic status. Sarah Chen handed Alicia a tablet containing the policy framework that had been developed during the corporate emergency response to the viral incident. The legal and communications teams had worked frantically to prepare comprehensive reforms that could be announced publicly. First, Alicia announced reading from the prepared statement, "We are eliminating all subjective passenger suitability assessments. Valid documentation will be the only criteria for boarding, regardless of how passengers choose to dress or present themselves." The policy change addressed the core issue that had led to Alicia's discrimination: the airline industry's reliance on appearance-based profiling disguised as security or quality control measures. Second, we are implementing mandatory bias recognition and civil rights training for every Monarch employee, from baggage handlers to pilots. This training will be conducted by external civil rights organizations and will include real-world scenarios and accountability measures. Emma's live stream audience responded positively to the comprehensive nature of the reforms. This is how you turn tragedy into change. Real policy changes, not just PR statements. Other airlines need to follow this example. Third, Alicia continued, we are establishing an independent passenger advocacy office that will investigate discrimination complaints and have direct authority to address bias incidents without corporate interference. The creation of an independent oversight mechanism demonstrated Alicia's commitment to accountability that couldn't be controlled or manipulated by company executives who might prioritize reputation management over justice. Fourth, we are implementing financial accountability measures. Any employee found guilty of discrimination will forfeit their pension benefits and face personal legal liability for civil rights violations. The financial consequences ensured that discrimination would carry personal costs that extended far beyond temporary suspension or retraining programs. James Thompson's audience was sharing clips of Alicia's announcement across multiple platforms, creating a viral moment of corporate accountability that was being praised by civil rights organizations and policy experts. Finally, Alicia announced, we are making these reforms open source. Any airline, hotel, transportation company, or hospitality business can access our training materials, policy frameworks, and implementation guides free of charge. The decision to share reform strategies rather than keeping them proprietary demonstrated that Alicia's primary goal was industry transformation rather than competitive advantage. David Kim approached Alicia as she concluded her announcement. Ms. Davidson's civil rights organizations are calling this the most comprehensive corporate response to discrimination they've seen in decades. Are you prepared for other companies to be measured against this standard? Alicia's response was immediate and confident. Mr. Kim, I hope every company will be measured against these standards. My father built this airline to connect people and cultures. Discrimination does the opposite. It divides and excludes. We're committed to being part of the solution. Officer Martinez, who had handled the security response professionally throughout the incident, stepped forward to offer additional support. Ms. Davidson, if you need law enforcement testimony for any federal investigations or policy development, Officer Johnson and I are prepared to provide detailed accounts of what we witnessed here today. The offer of law enforcement cooperation demonstrated that Alicia's handling of the incident had earned respect from professional security personnel who understood the difference between legitimate safety concerns and discriminatory profiling. Sarah Chen approached with information about media response to the announcement. Alicia, we're receiving interview requests from CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, and international outlets. The story is trending globally, and policy experts are calling your announcement a watershed moment for corporate accountability. But perhaps the most significant response came from the passengers who had witnessed the entire incident. As Alicia finally prepared to board her aircraft, they began applauding, not the performative applause of corporate events, but the genuine appreciation of people who had seen justice administered and change promised. Emma Rodriguez provided final commentary to her massive audience. I came here today to film luxury travel content. Instead, I documented the birth of a new standard for corporate accountability. This is how leaders should respond to discrimination, with immediate action, comprehensive reform, and transparent commitment to change. Isabella Rose, whose discriminatory videos had destroyed her social media career, posted a final apology video that received minimal engagement. Her attempt to capitalize on someone else's humiliation had ended her influencer career permanently. As Alicia Davidson finally boarded her aircraft, the aircraft she now owned flying the airline she now controlled, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented: the transformation of corporate discrimination into industry-wide reform through the courage of one woman who refused to accept injustice even when she had the power to seek revenge instead of pursuing justice. The JFK incident, as it came to be known in airline industry circles, had consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate terminations and policy announcements made at Gate B12. 6 months after Alicia Davidson's public humiliation became a catalyst for corporate transformation, the effects were being felt throughout the transportation industry and beyond. Tiffany Parker discovered that employment in the airline industry had become impossible for her. The viral footage of her discriminating against the company owner had made her unemployable at every major carrier. Background checks revealed her role in one of the most documented cases of workplace racism in recent history. She eventually found work at a suburban department store in Ohio where she earned less than half her previous salary and faced recognition from customers who remembered her from the viral videos. Her 8 years of building a career in premium airline service had been erased by 1 hour of discriminatory behavior. Captain Robert Hendricks faced even more severe consequences. The Federal Aviation Administration launched a formal investigation into his conduct, questioning whether his discriminatory actions represented a pattern that could affect flight safety. While his pilot's license wasn't revoked, several major airlines quietly removed him from consideration for future employment. He eventually took a position as a logistics coordinator for a cargo transport company, tracking trucks from a windowless office in Arizona. Every time an aircraft flew overhead, he was reminded of the career he had destroyed through his own prejudice and poor judgment. Miguel Santos and Ashley Ford both struggled to find employment in customer service roles. The viral documentation of their participation in discrimination had created a permanent record that employers could easily discover during background checks. Both eventually found work in industries where customer interaction was minimal and their past behavior was less likely to be recognized. Isabella Rose's influencer career never recovered from her celebration of discrimination against one of America's youngest black female CEOs. Her follower count dropped from 200,000 to fewer than 15,000, and brand partnerships disappeared entirely. She was forced to sell her luxury apartment and take a conventional job, learning too late that internet fame built on mocking others' humiliation was inherently unstable. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence was the industry-wide change that Alicia Davidson's reforms had inspired. The Dignity Initiative became a model that was adopted by airlines, hotels, restaurants, and other hospitality businesses across the globe. United Airlines implemented similar bias training requirements. Hilton Hotels created passenger advocacy offices. Even luxury brands began reviewing their customer service protocols to ensure that assumptions about appearance didn't lead to discriminatory treatment. The federal government took notice as well. The Department of Transportation launched an industry-wide review of airline passenger treatment policies, using Monarch's reforms as a baseline for regulatory requirements. Congress held hearings on discrimination in transportation that featured testimony from passengers who had documented bias incidents across multiple carriers. Civil rights organizations used the JFK incident as a template for corporate accountability campaigns. The immediate public response to discrimination became the standard against which other companies' crisis management was measured. David Kim, who had documented the incident and coordinated with civil rights groups, was invited to speak at corporate diversity conferences about the power of witness testimony and social media documentation in fighting discrimination. His live streams from Gate B12 became case study material in business schools and civil rights law programs. Emma Rodriguez leveraged her documentation of the incident into a new career as a civil rights travel blogger. Her authentic reporting and commitment to justice attracted a larger, more engaged audience than her previous luxury content ever had. She became a voice for accountability in the travel industry. Officer Martinez and Officer Johnson received commendations from their department for their professional handling of a discrimination incident. Their refusal to participate in racial profiling was cited as an example of proper law enforcement response to civil rights violations. James Thompson's Twitter documentation was archived by multiple universities and civil rights organizations as an example of how social media could serve as a tool for justice and accountability. His footage was used in documentaries and educational programs about modern civil rights activism. The gate area at JFK where the incident occurred was eventually renamed the Theodore Davidson Memorial Gate in honor of Alicia's father and the values he had tried to instill in his company. A small plaque commemorated the moment when corporate discrimination was transformed into industry-wide reform through the courage of one woman who refused to accept injustice. But perhaps most importantly, the incident established a new principle in corporate America that discrimination would face immediate public consequences, regardless of the perpetrator's position or seniority. The age of covering up bias and protecting discriminatory employees was ending, replaced by transparency and accountability. 6 months after the JFK incident transformed Monarch Airlines and influenced industry-wide reform, Alicia Davidson was traveling again. This time she was flying from London to Tokyo for the International Summit on Ethical Travel, a conference that had been inspired partly by her company's response to workplace discrimination. The London Heathrow departure experience was dramatically different from her previous journey. Check-in agents smiled warmly at all passengers regardless of their appearance. Gate staff treated every traveler with professional courtesy. The culture of exclusivity and judgment that had characterized luxury air travel was being replaced by genuine hospitality that honored dignity over assumptions. Alicia walked through the terminal wearing the same gray hoodie and comfortable jeans that had sparked her humiliation at JFK. But this time her casual attire was a deliberate choice rather than a product of grief and exhaustion. She was testing her own airline's commitment to the reforms she had implemented, ensuring that the changes were real rather than superficial. The response from Monarch employees was everything she had hoped for. Check-in agents processed her documentation with the same professionalism they showed every passenger. Gate staff welcomed her to board without questioning her appearance or making assumptions about her financial capacity to afford first-class service. But the most meaningful moment came as she settled into seat 1A, the same premium suite designation that had sparked an hour of discrimination at JFK. As she arranged her belongings and prepared for departure, a commotion at the cabin entrance caught her attention. A young man, probably in his early 20s, stood at the entrance to first class looking confused and slightly overwhelmed. He was wearing a backpack and a denim jacket that had seen better days. His jeans were clean but clearly worn, and his sneakers showed the signs of extensive use. He held his boarding pass uncertainly, clearly uncomfortable with the luxury surrounding him. "I think I was upgraded," the young man said to the flight attendant, his voice betraying both excitement and insecurity. "But I don't really look like I belong here." He glanced around the first-class cabin, taking in the business executives in expensive suits and luxury accessories. His body language suggested he was ready to retreat to economy class rather than risk the embarrassment of being told he didn't belong. The flight attendant who approached him was Carlos Rivera, a 29-year-old Hispanic crew member who had been hired during Monarch's post-incident recruitment drive. Carlos had been specifically trained in the Dignity Initiative protocols and understood that passenger respect was non-negotiable regardless of appearance or background. Carlos didn't look at the young man's worn jacket or scuffed shoes. He didn't make assumptions about his ability to afford first-class service. Instead, he looked directly at the boarding pass and then made eye contact with a brilliant, welcoming smile. "Mr. Thompson," Carlos said warmly, reading the name from the ticket, "Welcome to first class. You belong exactly where your ticket says you do. Let me take that heavy backpack for you and show you to your suite." Carlos treated the young man like a visiting dignitary, helping him with his belongings and explaining the cabin amenities with genuine enthusiasm. He didn't patronize or overcompensate. He simply provided the same level of service that every first-class passenger deserved. Alicia watched the interaction from her seat, feeling a lump form in her throat. This was what her father had envisioned when he built Monarch Airlines, a company that connected people across cultures and economic backgrounds without judgment or prejudice. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small framed photograph of Theodore Davidson, taken during the early days of the airline when he was still fighting to establish his vision of inclusive luxury travel. She placed it on the side table next to her seat. "We did it, Dad." She thought, her eyes misting slightly as she watched Carlos continue to provide exceptional service to every passenger regardless of their appearance or background. "We cleaned house and rebuilt the foundation." The young passenger, whose name was apparently David Thompson, was now settled comfortably in his first-class suite. He looked around with wonder and gratitude, understanding that he was experiencing something special, not just because of the luxury amenities, but because of the respect and dignity with which he had been treated. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and prepared for takeoff, Alicia reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months earlier, she had been a grieving daughter, wearing the same clothes, facing discrimination and humiliation from employees of her own company. Today, she was witnessing the fulfillment of reforms that had transformed not just Monarch Airlines, but the entire hospitality industry. The engines roared to life with the sound of freedom, connection, and possibility. As the aircraft lifted off, carrying passengers of all backgrounds who were being treated with equal dignity and respect, Alicia understood that her father's legacy was finally being fulfilled. She pulled her hood up, curled her legs onto the seat, and closed her eyes for the first time in months, without carrying the weight of injustice or the burden of reform. The peace she had been searching for since her father's death was finally within reach. The aircraft climbed through the clouds, carrying its diverse passengers toward their destinations. But more importantly, it carried the promise that air travel could be both luxurious and inclusive, that dignity didn't depend on designer labels, and that respect was a right rather than a privilege. Alicia Davidson had changed the world one hoodie at a time, proving that true class isn't about what you wear. It's about how you treat people who can do nothing for you. The crew who had once laughed at her appearance had learned the hardest lesson of all: when you judge someone by their appearance, you usually end up revealing the ugliness of your own character. And that is how Alicia Davidson transformed an industry and redefined corporate accountability through quiet dignity and unwavering principle. She showed us that true leadership isn't about seeking revenge. It's about creating change that ensures others won't face the same injustice. The crew of Flight 802 thought they were humiliating a nobody in cheap clothes, Instead, they ended up crowning a queen who would use her power to protect everyone who came after her. They learned that when you treat people as less than human, you reveal everything about your own character and nothing about theirs. Alicia's story reminds us that the person you dismiss today might be the person you answer to tomorrow. More importantly, it shows us that every person deserves respect regardless of their appearance, background, or the size of their bank account. Dignity isn't earned through designer clothes or expensive accessories. It's a birthright that belongs to every human being. If this story moved you, if you cheered for justice and felt the power of accountability, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because change only happens when we refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. We upload powerful stories like this every single week that will inspire you, make you think, and remind you that good always triumphs over evil. So make sure you hit that notification bell so you never miss when we drop new content. Next week, we have an incredible story about a homeless veteran who walks into a luxury restaurant only to reveal he's the owner's father. The staff's reaction will blow your mind, and the ending will have you in tears. If you enjoyed this story, you'll also love our video about the janitor who was mocked by executives until they discovered he was the company's new owner. And don't miss our story about the teacher who was fired for standing up to bullying, only to return as the school district's new superintendent. The links to both of those amazing stories are in the description below. Until then, treat each other with kindness, stand up for what's right, and never forget that true class comes from character, not clothing. Remember, you never know who you're talking to, so treat everyone with the respect they deserve. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.
Осуждаю! Ты что, да меловой, да Микселвер. Ты что, деловой дэн пошел? Да Микселвер.
Здорово, тут все, Витосик, Питонцик.
И, блядь, Стас Пьеха тоже здесь.
Птичка 010 тоже тут.
Ты больше похож на Стаса Костюшкина. Стас Борецкий. Борецкий Стас. Витол, ты на Стаса Борецкого.
Тихо, тихо, тихо.
Моя подруга с центра. А я с окраины. Где мой красный пиджак? Осуждаю, Сэм. Осуждаю. Заебался. С утра пораньше 6 запрещенных кинул.
Бетон зачем?
Стрим где залил? Зашли там ку-ку-ку пишут или что пишут? Пишут что-нибудь типа много, ку-ку-ку вот так.
Да, ос.
Ос, пацан. Пацан, нормально, мне идет F90 покупать мне ее.
Вот смотри, как сидишь, ты как ребенок просто.
Да иди нахуй. А тут сзади место пиздец. Даже.
Не, реально, ты очень близко сидишь.
Близко?
Да.
А ноги короткие. Как мне сидеть, блядь, я не понимаю.
Бать звук сзади.
Брат, спроси.
Пол должны.
Спроси у братьев своих.
Бля, я сегодня поднял чуть-чуть сиденье, блядь, так, наверное, удобнее. И мне сразу же вы засунули. Я всегда в пол сидел, понял? Сегодня поднял. Это пиздец сзади. Вот смотри, сейчас один нажму, свое положение, вот видишь?
Не, ты сейчас Витосу ноги сломаешь.
Блин, нормально, тут далеко еще.
Да?
Место вагон, что нажми газ, ебать.
Здорово всем, мы едем.
Звони, дружище.
Давай как следует.
Бать звук
В
классный.
отсечку.
Бля, погода.
Сапку взгрейте, братья.
Ой.
Блядь.
Почему?
Самый, блядь.
Самая лучшая машина, блядь, в мире.
Реально.
Лаганая заслонка в мире.
Трет.
А?
Что хотел сказать? А, почему на Ладу Акропович не делают?
Сейчас сделаем, блядь. Виту не делаем, что ли?
Смотрите,
Юра Волков в Москве, блядь. Анар пишет, блядь. Что ты хочешь, сучка моя?
О.
поэтому все оповещения.
Чмо? Завтра прилетаю. Окей, чмо.
Здорово, Педи.
Осуждаю.
Приезжай, что могу сказать. Тебя бедового
Гребаный дождь. Короче, сейчас едем в автосалон Лада Трансформер, или как называется? Сын, как называется? Лада
Трансавто.
Лада Трансавто едет туда.
Вот так, да, ты
А
общаешься.
нахуй я сказал, что с этого приедет? Ладно, не приезжай.
Приезжайте все туда, пацаны. Стрим там будет, фотка, короче.
Короче, объясняю.
Приезжайте со всеми, именно Равшан будет фоткаться со
Автограф
всеми.
сессия. Прокачет на 90, на все.
Не, Адам тоже автограф сессии может сделать.
Где? Ладно. Адам в натуре застройщик, блядь. Сходка, ура.
Не сигналь, не сигналь.
О, не сигнальте. Едем нам ехать 20 минут, так что давайте не, блядь.
А Адам почему не?
2,4К собирается
А,
покупать
там
это
что?
корыто, ошалеть мне. Да пошел ты нахуй, бля, мне по кайфу, понял? Покупай, пошел ты, пофиг, бля. Зато я первый, нахуй. Понял? Зато я первый.
Брат, а что с грантой?
Продаем?
Да, можно ли назвать победой, когда ты первым Ладу покупаешь?
Не, ну это хайповая машина.
Идите нахуй просто. Маша, я уже купил по клинике 7
На
раз.
первом месте идет BMW M5 E60, на втором Lada Vesta Sport.
Джон,
Рестайлинг.
Е60, что там?
Все,
А нахуй вы сели?
На первом месте вообще
Нахуй Сэму назад
ДДУ.
посадили, объясните.
все вопросы деловому Дэну.
Вам не
Деловой
стыдно,
Дэн.
блядь?
Е60, как у меня,
За что?
нормально, скоро будет починиться.
А Ракелову купи Гранту. Че, охуели, что мне еще? А Сирано айфон лучше. Рашан Заропа, скажи, пожалуйста, как называется выхлоп на F90? Акрапович, блядь,
Без
нахуй
сил.
спрашиваешь такие вещи, блядь. Стыдно должно быть. В стае, знаешь, как принято, блядь, машину не покупаешь, уже Акрапович едет. Жан, скажи, пожалуйста, как называется выхлоп? Да иди нахуй, блядь!
О,
Петипович.
тяжело.
Осуждаю этот.
Блять, Вито, ну BMW зап, конечно, шумит, я ебался.
Бля, я этот мем запустился, видели?
Тяжело.
Когда вот этот я сделал, Литвин, все, перед в ТикТок зайди, там ужас происходит, отвечаю. Там катастрофа началась.
А что за прикол был?
Короче, этот Марат сделал прикол, я повторил, и мем получился.
А, родился, да, надо в прямом эфире.
Литвин,
Вы
бля.
на Тургенева были, малые кричали, да?
Да.
Тихо. Вот, нам вообще...
А прямо надо было?
Нет, так вот, тебя быстрее, мол,
Что
пока.
хуяр здесь боком только? Банкротство гарантии.
Чё?
Ой, ой,
О,
он что хочет? Сосать хочет.
Бля, да нахуй. Даже, сука, классно, бля.
Главную трубу трахал. Бля, сегодня что-то шумно на улице, бля, после спортзала пиздец, бля, здорово.
Сын, блядь,
Здорово.
накачался.
Ну сейчас похавает, он вообще будет
Надо
разъебывать, не?
похавать, пацаны, мне
Я
пизда.
тоже не хочу сейчас.
Глютен
Сейчас
глаза, блядь.
Владе не закидываемся потом едой, блядь. Все, что
Не,
есть.
брат, Сэм
Бля,
направили.
какая полоса из этих влево, которую там.
Маш направо ныряй и по кругу ебашь.
Да.
Паш сам правый.
Боком.
Ну быстрее, Равшан.
Блять, сука!
Самую правую, послушай
Ёп.
меня, ебашь, едь.
Боком.
Как
Боком,
есть?
едь. Едь, крутись надо.
Вот это
Крутись,
просто.
крутись по кругу. По кругу.
Але... Стой!
Бля,
Блять, сука!
я Сэма слушал,
Запутались.
у нас полное доверие, если он мне колет, ну,
Мужчина, брат. Нахуй, блядь, его стопаете, ебаный.
долбоёб, мне вот сюда надо.
Равшан,
ебать,
не.
долбоёб, тут
Не, по
поменяли
кругу.
все, ёбаный.
Не, по кругу ебашь, Рав, по кругу. Не
кругу.
заебал.
Круговой.
Там быстрее проедем. Это лайфхак.
У нас
Нормально,
орали,
не надо
понял,
по
если
кругу.
говорит человек,
Кубанский.
нельзя заднюю давать.
Мужчина, блядь, Равшан, блядь. Красавчик Пятигорский, наш акцент, блядь.
Ужас. Лоша,
А где Кеша?
Он с пупсик.
Закрой круг.
Бля, вот гордо.
По рельсам.
Ага, блядь.
Звук отстает.
Надо тут как раз потом недалеко ехать.
Да, с Ларакубанга, давай,
Да,
крутись. И там будет...
Дальше.
Дальше.
Дальше. Не, здесь, дальше. Вон зеленый горит, видишь?
Здесь стоять будет.
Проскочишь. Аккуратно.
Твой брат едет.
Направо даешь. Все,
Светофор, видишь, зеленый.
Хорошо здесь было. Тихо.
Блядь. Всем стоять, нахуй. Руки на...
Равшан, слышал вчера?
Сэм
Тип
стоять.
50 наебнул, дрифт 010. Петух.
О,
У него треснул, как называется?
Спина, блядь, треснула.
Кардан бахнул.
жоп треснул.
Когда мне тут не бабахнул.
Еще один, блядь.
Подрумынник там треснул.
Ой, как расцветает красиво. Офигеть.
Бля, Япония
Долбоёб, блядь, расцветает в 15 часов.
С тобой
Не
что?
знаю, что.
А, расцветает.
Расцветали яблони, груши, поплыли туманы над рекой. Выходила на берег Катюша, на высокий берег на крутой. Выходила, песню заводила, про того, чьи песни берегла. И Равшан.
Бля, вот это яме 1000 лет. Тут на F10 уебал шишку поймал. Вот эту яму.
Можешь на видео как
Торцовый
мужчина
я.
делать тоже?
Блядь, ебать.
Блять, жарко вашей, блять, хуй машине.
Да хуй вы Сэма назад посадили, он сзади не может сидеть.